So I'm a 19-year-old girl. I received a package. I don't remember ordering anything. I thought that maybe it had been a gift from my friends or something. Oh God, was I wrong. Opening the package was like pulling an aeroplane apart. It was wrapped with hundreds of layers of tape and zip ties. After about 3 hours of struggling, I finally opened the package. Telling you that I was horrified was an understatement. There was a human hand inside, and a foot. It may be funny to you, but I was traumatized. Just after seeing that, there was a knock on my door. I was looking through the peephole to see who it could be. There was a man. A man that I had never seen before. I was kind of used to this. Everyone told me how perfect I was. I didn't ever enjoy it. People envied me for it, and I had many stalkers. So I just ignored it. But the man did not like that. He kept banging on my door. I looked through the peephole again, and there he was. Except the fact that this time, the man had white eyes and no mouth. That's when I really started panicking. Just then, there were police sirens outside. I was still looking through the peephole, and that's when the man started glitching. Like this was not reality, and I was dreaming, and all of this never even happened. I pinched myself, looking for clocks, and slapped myself. Nothing. At that point, I knew that it was my end. I started crying hysterically, but then I realized crying wasn't going to help. I grabbed a butcher's knife from the kitchen and got ready to push the door open so that the man would get knocked down. Just as I was about to do that, I woke up. What? But that wasn't a dream, except the fact that it was. I was happy that I wasn't going to die, so I walked towards the living room, but what I saw really made me want to die. My butcher's knife wasn't there, and there it was, a package in my porch that looked exactly like the one I had opened in my dream. Or was it really a dream? The new house was everything we had hoped for. It was our first home, and it was a steal of a price. It was during the second week after we moved in that I discovered the trapdoor. My wife Ria had charged me with stowing some extra boxes under the house. There was some decent storage in the 2-level house, but it was quickly filled up with our various junk. 4 boxes needed to be put in the crawl space. The listing called it a basement, but that was a lie. Still, storage was storage, and we'd barely be using it after all. I lifted the fitted planks of wood that led below the first floor. It was hiding neatly under a rug in the laundry room. I had only glanced inside once before, when we first checked out the property. It was as dark and riddled with cobwebs as the first time. I dragged the boxes next to the hole and dropped down inside. It was about 3 feet high, with a dirt floor. Something scampered away into the dark. I turned on the flashlight and pointed the beam around the crypt-like biome. I jumped when the light focused on a figure in the corner, only to realize it was an old mirror resting against the foundation. I crawled on hands and knees towards it, curious if it was a rare antique. Further examination made it apparent that it was cracked and of poor quality. In the reflection, I noticed a hatch on the underside of the floor. I turned and found the circular hatch almost directly above me. Maybe I was distracted by the mirror, but it seems odd I would have crawled past without noticing such a weird panel of wood. It was rotted and chipped with a black iron bar across the middle. It had a small handle which beckoned to me to investigate further. I must have been roughly below the kitchen. I slid a small latch free and gently pushed the hatch up. I looked up, and my skin went cold. This was not the kitchen. There was framework made of the same rotted wood, and the roof jutted up into sharp, angular, inverted spires. It was like the attic of some other, older house. This house had no attic. It only had 2 floors, and the top floor had a very meagre attic area that was closed off and quite small, not even a couple of feet at its highest point. There was an entire room. An odd dread filled me as soon as I stood up inside the room, hoisting myself up as I stood on the dry, cracked boards. There were no windows, but light was pouring in through slats in the walls. It seemed unfinished, like an old barn. Every plank of wood was grey. I turned around and was startled to find a whole side behind me I didn't notice upon first inspection. The other end of the attic funneled down into a crooked little corner. There was a raised floor, and there were about 7 or 8 desks. They looked like ancient school desks, fashioned from the same wood as everything else. There was a sort of stool affixed next to each desk. They seemed strange and oddly proportioned. I turned in horror to find the latch closed shut. I walked back to it, suddenly aware how my loud steps creaked and echoed, and that's when I realized how horrible this place truly was. How the light wasn't coming from one side, but all sides. It wasn't the sun shining through. And those awful desk things were so big and so unfamiliar. It was like a kindergarten for things older than myself, older than this house. I also felt that it wasn't an old place with its residents long gone. They just hadn't come back yet. I scrambled for the handle on the hatch, but it was flush with its resting spot. I dug at the little metal loop frantically, sure that I was no longer safe, no longer undetected. I felt something, a sixth sense of something to my right, back towards the crooked end of this attic tomb. I looked. Something recoiled away with a disturbing quickness. It was phantom-like, not at all human. It had a head like a bird's skull, a long needle appendage for a mouth, long arms which clawed and twitched in the air. I was horrified, but I couldn't look away. It was like looking at a mirage that was frantically undulating into abstract prismatic forms. The longer I stared, I realized I was ruining it somehow, maybe even hurting it, by keeping my eyes fixed on its awful, ever-changing form. It was entirely silent, and as it slowly shrank and convulsed, I could only hear my panicked breath, only feel my heart in my chest. It was lashing around, diminishing in size, falling back into the furthest corner of the room, and then it was too small to see. I turned and grabbed at the latch and finally hooked my finger under. I pulled it ajar, diving inside and frantically closing it behind me. I slid the lock tight. I climbed out, kicked the boxes into the hole, and put the planks back. I rolled the rug over and slumped over, wheezing. It's been years since that day. I often wonder where that place was. Perhaps it's some in-between plane of existence, not designed for us. Things that aren't meant to be seen by human eyes. But even though I'm safe and sound with my wife, who doesn't know a thing, just trying to move on, there's 2 questions that still keep me up at night. What would have happened if I hadn't turned around soon enough? And just how tightly did I lock that latch? Billy was a curious child who loved exploring the woods near his home. One day, while playing hide-and-seek with his friends, he got lost and couldn't find his way back. As he wandered deeper into the woods, he heard the howls of wolves and the sound of footsteps behind him. Suddenly, as he stumbled upon a hunter holding a torch, but instead of being relieved, Billy felt even more scared. The hunter had a sinister smile on his face and blood stains on his clothes. As Billy tried to run away, he heard the growls of the wolves getting closer and the sound of someone or something chasing him. Suddenly, he saw a figure in the shadows, a black figure with long hair and a tattoo on his face. Billy's heart raced as he realized this was not a human, but something far more sinister. He stumbled upon a tree with a pile of clothes and a skeleton lying underneath it. Billy realized with horror that he had stumbled into a trap set by the hunter. The mummy-like black figure began to chase him, but Billy managed to climb up the tree to escape. However, as he reached the top of the tree, he realized that the tree was the lair of the black figure and that he had made a terrible mistake. The hunter and the black figure closed in on him, and Billy screamed for help, but no one came. He was trapped, and it seemed like there was no escape from this nightmare. The howls of the wolves and the laughter of the hunter filled the air as Billy's fate hung in the balance. Just as the hunter and the black figure were about to grab him, the pack of wolves appeared out of nowhere and chased them away. Billy was shocked and relieved at the same time. He climbed down from the tree and followed the wolves, hoping they would lead him back home. As he walked, he heard strange noises and whispers in the dark, but the wolves always kept him safe. After hours of walking, he finally saw the lights of his village and ran towards them, crying with joy. He told his parents about his terrifying experience, and they immediately called the authorities. A search party was sent out into the woods to find the hunter and this mysterious black figure, but they never returned. It was as if they vanished into thin air. After that night in the woods, Billy was never quite the same. He was haunted by the memories of the hunter and the black figure. Every night he would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing their laughter and footsteps in the dark. As time passed, strange things started happening in the village. People went missing, never to be seen again, and strange symbols and markings were found etched into trees near the woods. The villagers whispered about the return of the hunter, and they warned others not to go near the woods. But Billy felt a strange pull towards the woods, as if he was being called back. One night he couldn't resist the urge any longer, and went back into the woods, following the same path he took that fateful night. As he walked, he heard the whispers of the black figure and the hunter getting louder and louder. He suddenly saw the tree with the pile of clothes and the skeleton, and the hunter and the black figure appeared from the shadows. This time, however, they were not alone. They had an army of mummified creatures with them, and they closed in on Billy, trapping him in the tree. The hunter raised his knife and cackled with laughter as he approached Billy, but just as he was about to strike, the pack of wolves appeared once again, snarling and growling. The hunter and the figure fought back, but the wolves were too strong. They devoured the hunter and the black figure, along with their entire army of mummies. But just as Billy thought he was safe, he saw the eyes of the wolves turn towards him. Glowing with an unnatural light, he screamed in terror as they closed in, ready to feast on their next prey. From that day on, Billy was never seen or heard from again. Many people believe he was consumed by the pack of wolves, but one thing is for certain: the village was never the same again, and the whispers of the strange happenings in the woods would still continue to this day. When I was 11, my auntie and uncle moved into a new house. A month later, I had a sleepover with my cousin. Me and my cousin were close, and still are very close with each other. We would have sleepovers a lot, mainly on the weekends and school holidays. This time, it was more exciting, because I would be sleeping in their new house for the first time. Fast forward a couple of hours, and we should have been asleep since it was past 1:45 in the morning. My cousin Sophie went downstairs to get more snacks for us, and a few seconds later, I heard her running back upstairs. She told me she saw someone outside, and they had a torch on their head, shining it through the windows. We immediately ran to my aunt's and uncle's room. My uncle went downstairs to see what was going on, and we stayed upstairs with my aunt. A couple of minutes passed, and my uncle came back and said that there was nobody there. The police then showed up because my aunt had called them, and they had a good look around the house and garden. Again, like my dad said, they saw nobody and left. I don't think anyone slept that night. My uncle got out a blow-up bed and slept on the floor, and let me and my cousin sleep in bed with my aunt. It was really scary. Every noise I heard, I thought someone was going to break in. The morning eventually came around, and it was all good. Once there was a girl named Joanne who attended a mysterious and foreboding school. Despite its dark and creepy appearance, Joanne always seemed to be drawn to the old building and loved to explore its dark and musty halls. One day, while she was wandering the deserted halls during a free period, Joanne heard a strange noise coming from one of the classrooms. She cautiously approached the door. As she opened it, she was met with a terrifying sight. The room was filled with shadows, and the desks and chairs were arranged in strange and unusual ways. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and the room was plunged into darkness. Joanne tried to find the light switch, but it was as if the room had taken on a life of its own. The shadows started to move, and the furniture began to creak and groan. Panic set in as Joanne realized she was trapped in this haunted classroom. The shadows took on the form of dark, twisted figures, and the noise grew louder and more frantic. Joanne tried to escape, but the door was now locked from the outside. She was trapped. As the horrors of the haunted classroom closed in around her, Joanne realized that this was not just any ordinary school. It was a place where the dead were trapped, unable to escape their torment, and now she was one of them. Joanne was never seen or heard from again. Some say that she is still trapped in that haunted classroom, doomed to spend eternity in terror and fear. Others believe that she became a part of the school itself, her ghost forever wandering its dark halls. But one thing is for sure, no one who enters that old and creepy school ever comes out unchanged. My name is John, and when I was younger, while I was exploring the woods near my home, I stumbled upon a strange cage. As I approached it, I noticed a dog barking frantically inside. I tried to open the cage, but it was locked tight. Suddenly, a squirrel scampered by, and I chased after it, hoping to make a new furry friend. As I chased the squirrel, I suddenly found myself in front of a ship, docked at the nearby beach. Curiosity getting the better of me, I climbed aboard and started exploring. But as I went deeper into the ship, I realized that something was off. The ship was old and decrepit, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling out to me from the shadows. I followed the sound, and it led me to a dark, damp cave. As I entered the cave, I was immediately overcome by a feeling of dread. The walls were covered in cobwebs, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I soon realized that the voice I had heard was not friendly. It was a sinister whisper, taunting me to come closer. Panicking, I tried to turn back, but the voice grew louder and more insistent. I felt as though I was being pulled deeper into the cave until I finally stumbled upon a shocking sight. There, in the center of the cave, was the cage I had seen earlier, but this time, the dog was nowhere to be seen. I realized then that the dog had been taken by some kind of monster, and that I was next. I was trapped in the cave with no way out and no one to help me. I could hear the whispers growing louder, and I knew that I was about to face my worst nightmare. But just as I thought all was lost, I heard a familiar bark. It was the dog, barking from somewhere deep within the cave. With newfound hope, I followed the sound, determined to save my new furry friend. And as I ventured deeper into the darkness, I realized that the monster was not as frightening as I first thought. It was a figment of my imagination, conjured up by the isolation and fear of the unknown. With the dog safe in my arms, I made my way back to the ship and eventually back to the safety of my home. But that experience left a lasting impression on me, and I never ventured into the woods or onto any ship ever again. There was once a young husband and wife who were as madly in love as they were poor. They wished to start a family but could not afford a house big enough to let one grow. Despite this, after years of saving every penny and cutting every unneeded expense, the couple finally had enough for a home. Unfortunately, this home was one they were going to have to build themselves. They found a cheap piece of land in the country, a lumber company, and were finally ready to let their dream come true. After all was said and done, the couple had themselves a small yet cozy cabin with just enough room for a nursery. Along with this, the couple had welcomed the lifestyle of the country, with the husband taking up hunting and the wife becoming the house caretaker while also carrying their first child. But as the months went on, the wife began to suspect that their house was not fit for a child. While this seemed a simple thought, the wife could not provide any reason for her to feel this way. The only way she could put this feeling into words was that the walls felt uneven and the floors felt sunken. The wife would also complain the windows seemed fogged over no matter how hard she polished, and the dust never seemed to stay away, even if she cleaned every day. With the birth of their first child approaching, the husband decided that he had had enough of his wife's irrational fear and contacted the lumber company they had bought the property from. The husband explained through a series of phone calls that his wife believed that the supplies they were sold were damaged and that they would like for their home to be inspected. Almost immediately, the company obliged, and they sent a representative down to examine the house. Upon taking a look around, the representative could not find any signs of misconstruction or structural damage, but did note that there was a strange feeling to the house. Similar to the wife, The representative could not truly explain their feeling, with only being able to put it as the air felt thick, the shadows ever present, and it was as if every moment gave noise from the house. This response infuriated the husband, who demanded that he be given some solution to his wife's fear. The representative, out of pity, explained to the husband that there was a local doctor who treats strange cases like this, and gave him a phone number to call. The husband quickly called the doctor and explained his worrying situation. The doctor showed great fascination with the couple's dilemma, and came as quickly as he could. Upon arriving, the doctor began to examine the house, but, in a way, far different than the representative. The doctor listened to the wind come through the windows, the creaks of the floorboards, and the squeaks of the cupboard doors. After minutes of testing, the doctor declared to the couple that their house was sick. This confused the couple, with their worries only deepening. The doctor saw this concern and quickly explained that a new house is much like a baby. One must clean, care for, and nurse it. While the first two principles made sense, the last struck a nerve with the couple. The husband emotionally asked how and why in the world do you feed a house? The doctor stated again that the house is much like a baby, and that one feeds a house by filling it with food. Because it was obvious that the couple had no idea how to properly take care of a new home, the doctor prescribed them a regime to follow for the coming months. The husband was instructed to hunt twice the amount of food he typically did, and the wife was told to cook meals twice as big as she typically did, with whatever they did not use to be given to the house. The doctor, along with these rules, said that he will be checking in once a month to see how the house is growing. Surprisingly, the couple listened to the doctor's peculiar advice, and did so for the next month. He kept his promise as well, and arrived a month later in order to see how the house was coming along. Upon seeing the house, the doctor noted that there was a new colour to its walls, a brighter light through its windows, and that it almost seemed to have gotten bigger. Pleased with this development, the doctor knocked on the front door, only to be greeted by the couple, who had sunken eyes and pale skin. The doctor showed great concern, and asked them how they felt. The husband explained that him and his wife had become exhausted over the last month due to long days of housework and restless nights. The doctor further asked why the couple was unable to sleep, to which the husband replied that the house bumps and cracks in the night, comparing it to the cries of growing pain. The husband also asked how much longer the house will grow, as his wife was expected to give birth soon. The doctor reassured the couple that at the rate the house was going, they should expect the house to stop growing within the next few weeks, and that he would check in again to make sure everything went as expected. This checkup would not go as expected, as instead of the doctor going to the couple, they would come to him. Only a week after their last visit, the couple appeared before the doctor's door, pleading for him to help the wife. It appeared that physical stress of the last month had triggered an early labor. The couple's dream of having a family was coming true. The doctor warned that the wife should stay in his care until she gains her strength back, but the couple insisted that they welcome their new child into the home as soon as possible, and went about their way. Despite the previous untimely visit, the doctor decided to maintain his promise of seeing the house once again, even if he expected nothing to change. But upon seeing the house, the doctor was in utter shock at the building that stood before him. Where there was once a small, barely 2-room cabin, stood a massive, beautiful 2-story house. Hesitantly, the doctor knocked at the door and was greeted by the husband. But something was extremely wrong. The once tired yet driven man that existed a few weeks ago had been replaced by a husk of his former self. The husband did not speak a word to the doctor, but rather looked him in the eyes with a stare that could only be taken as that of a corpse. The husband proceeded to silently lead the doctor into the house, and into what appeared to be a makeshift nursery. Then, without a warning, dropped to his knees and wept a strong, powerful cry. He then, through broken words, said, "We filled the house with food." The doctor walked over to the crib to only find that there was no sign of a baby. At that moment, the doctor realized that along with the baby, there was no sign of the healing wife. He quickly ran through the halls and rooms of the house only to discover that the husband was the only other sign of life. But that thought was cut short by a feeling that he was being watched, but not by that of a peer, but rather by a predator. The walls seemed as if they were going to crush him into dust, and the floor felt as if it was going to eat him alive. Without hesitation, the doctor ran out of the house and as far away as his legs could take him. He would never return to that house, and he would never hear of the husband ever again. It is said that the house was left to crumble in the country, or perhaps it still waits for another family to call it home. It was a dark and stormy night when Karen and her friends decided to explore the abandoned house on the outskirts of town. They had heard rumours of strange things happening there, and were determined to get to the bottom of it. As they entered the house, they noticed that it was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, walls were smeared with strange markings, and there was an eerie silence that filled the air. They made their way through the living room, the kitchen, and eventually came upon a locked door. Karen and her friends managed to break the lock, and what they found beyond it was more horrifying than anything they could have ever imagined. A young woman was hanging from the ceiling, her eyes wide open, and her skin cold to the touch. The group was shocked, but they quickly realized that they were not alone in that house. A figure appeared in the doorway, shrouded in darkness, and as they reached out, they saw that its hands were missing and its eyes were void of life. It was then that they realized that the woman hanging from the ceiling was not only the victim, but one of many who had met their end in this house. As the group tried to escape, they were attacked by the mysterious figure who was revealed to be a serial killer who had been hiding in the shadows of the house for years. The group was running out of time, and they had to use all of their wits to survive. But just when they thought that they had made it out alive, they were forced with one final plot twist. The serial killer was actually Karen's long-lost twin sister, who had been jealous of her success and had taken it upon herself to eliminate anyone who crossed their path. In the end, Karen and her friends had to face their fears and confront the monster that had been hiding in plain sight, realizing too late that sometimes the greatest horrors come from those closest to us. I woke up with a throbbing headache. I could almost feel a brick pounding against the sides of my skull. Had I had too much to drink? No, this was different. I felt like I had been filled with air, and I had this feeling that I had forgotten something important. I tried squinting my eyes open, but it was dark. I could see everything, but it was almost like a world away. I tried walking to the kitchen counter to make myself a cup of coffee. Everything felt heavier. I turned around to look at myself in the mirror, and it was the first time I heard it. A cry. A sad, desperate cry. At first, I panicked, but then I tried to ignore it. Then it happened again, and again, and it felt like the person who cried was always right behind me. I tried to toss every piece of furniture upside down looking for this person, but everything felt just too heavy. Was I going crazy? Had I been drugged? I looked outside my window. An ambulance stood downstairs. They were carrying a dead body, wrapped in a thick piece of black plastic, like it was garbage. Had old Miss Edmonds passed away? I ran outside my apartment and made my way across the 4-foot deep snow. "Is that Miss Edmonds?" I asked, but no one seemed to care. They looked right past me. I felt sick. Did her life really mean so little? I walked past the van, and I suddenly caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Was that Miss Edmonds' sister? My head throbbed, probably because of the winter. I reached my hand to massage my forehead. I felt a hot liquid. I brought my hand back down, and it was covered in blood. Blood that was dripping down onto the snow, and then suddenly I remembered. I remembered everything that had happened last night, although it felt like someone else's memories. I remember pulling the trigger. I remember holding the cold, hard metal to my head. I remembered that the familiar face was my mother. I ran towards her, but she didn't seem to understand. It was like there was a glass door between us. Was I dead? Is this what I would do for the rest of eternity? Would I ever be able to talk to anyone? I felt trapped in my own glass chamber. Was this hell? I had so many questions, yet no answers, because I was dead and alone. This was not like I had hoped. This was exactly like my life on Earth, except now I was truly alone. Whatever you do, don't open the curtains. Now, I know you might think I'm being silly. Trust me, that's what I thought too. Growing up, my mum always told me, don't open your curtains. At the time, I just never questioned it, but thought, oh, she's just being silly. But boy, was I wrong. It was a Sunday morning. Mum was going about her usual cleaning the whole house, ready for the following week. I was 16. My mum was in the kitchen, pottering about, and I was in my room, reading and listening to music. It was a decent volume, loud enough for me to hear, but not quite loud enough for it to bother my mum. I had all my windows shut and no fan on, but suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I could see my curtain moving ever so slightly. I froze, put my book down, and walked over to my curtain and moved it ever so slightly. Not enough to fully open them, but to see what was there. And to my surprise, there was nothing. I thought I was seeing things, so I sat back down and went to pick my book up again, and it moved. Same thing. Nothing there. So I went to sit, and again it started moving. By this time, I had had enough. I grabbed my curtains and froze, hearing my mother's voice. Whatever you do, don't open your curtains. But I had to. I wish I didn't. I wish I'd listened. With all my might, I flung the curtains back, expecting to be blind, but there was nothing. No light, no sound, nothing. It was at that moment I realized I was underground. I ran to my mum, who strangely enough was still by the sink. "Mum, Mum, we're underground," I yelled frantically. But she didn't move. It was like she didn't hear me. I started shaking her arm, but it fell off in my hand. I screamed and threw it leaping back. She didn't move. When she didn't move, I slowly peeked around to see her face, her beautiful, rotting, maggot-eaten face. Now this is something I really want to talk about. to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. Now, for context, I lived in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It was an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to the absence of residents. Me and many friends were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so what we did was explore these abandoned buildings. Prior to the experience I am about to talk about, we never had anything too crazy happen to us. Occasionally, we'd see a small bit of blood like liquid, and we did a pentagram on the ground from someone who went to a house previously, but nothing too bad, until the last time I had gone exploring abandoned buildings. Now, when I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part mental hospital. A weird combination, I know. It closed down due to a lack of patients and lack of children at the daycare. I decided to go back there with my friends a few years ago. For context, I was 15 when this happened. Most of my friends were the same age. When we did get there, it was rather cliché. There was fog, it was rather dark, and there was a light drizzle of rain. We went to the main gate, which was padlocked shut. We decided to help each other hop over, and it made a ton of noise. We were laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was to come. We looked around the small play area with flashlights we had on our person. Even with our somewhat powerful flashlights, our visibility was rather limited. We decided to enter the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos, wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls and toys strewn about. The further we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent until all that we could hear was the crunch of the dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to pick them up when all of a sudden we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door leading to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I all looked at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of them were very bold and cocky. We all looked at each other when my friend Brian suggested we go and look to see where the sound came from. Personally, I was not too fond of the idea, but with the group of friends there was no way anyone was going to decline such things. We all stacked up on the door and opened it. It was rusted to the floor and we heaved to get it open. As we walked in, the metallic smells and must became stronger, with a hint of something else which I couldn't quite put my finger on at that moment. We walked in and our flashlights pointed in every direction, with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight, and to the left and right were the occasional metal doorway, some with doors open. I felt slightly claustrophobic, and it felt a little hard to breathe. As we continued, Brian shone his flashlight into a room and recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What is it?" I asked him. I thought I saw something here. It all seems fine now. To be honest, I thought he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety, but looking back, I think he was being completely honest. He backed out of the room and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward, when another friend swiftly told us to stop. We came to a halt and all listened. In the distance, ahead of us, we heard the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echo through the hallway. We all looked at each other, fear in each of our eyes. Brian continued walking toward the sounds. We considered turning back for a second without Brian, wondering if some ghost or something was in the building. But we couldn't do that to him. The closer we got, the more I felt like I was being watched. When finally we entered a room on the right which had the smell of rotting meat. In front of us was a dead deer. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. That's when we heard whispering from somewhere. Brian shone his flashlight to the corner of the room where a man with short hair was standing with his head down. He wore a bright green t-shirt stained with what I assume was blood and torn beige pants. He did not have any socks and his feet seemed damaged. He was twitching sporadically and continued to mumble even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. He looked up at us with a haunting grin that sent shivers down our spine. "You guys here for the feast?" He said each word with varying inflection and energy. This kicked us over the edge, and we bolted out of that room all the way back to the daycare center. The door was still open, and we decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and pure weight of the door almost kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all of our strength to close it, and just before we did, I could still see the silhouette of a man watching us, his white teeth being the only other human feature I could see. As we sat behind the metal door, catching our breath for a second, all looking at each other for confirmation that we all saw the same thing. After a small bit of laboured breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the door. That's when we decided it was time to leave. We booked it, out of the vicinity completely, and ran home. A year after we visited that spot, police went back to do a routine search of the area and found the man. It was stated that this guy used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He escaped from the facility he was transferred to and lived off of the wildlife around the complex. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sickness from eating raw meat. His mental condition was much worse than before. There were future rumours that he did kill someone in the forest while searching for food, but nothing has been confirmed. In the end, guys, just be careful, especially in dangerous areas such as abandoned buildings. I am at the house at 542 Crooked Brook Drive. I remember the day Margaret Forrester and her son Tanner, with the brilliantly bright blonde hair, arrived on my doorstep. Mother and son had been on the run for months, always one step ahead of Margaret's abusive husband, Tom. They had been bouncing between living in a car and staying in shelters since their escape. So, when they arrived, exhausted and desperate for a place to call home, I welcomed them with open doors and a warm fire blazing. I was so glad to have a new family to fill my walls with life once more. I'd sat empty for so long, abandoned yet still in decent shape. I sat hidden in the woods on the outskirts of a small town that had fallen victim to a crumbling economy. Could I be the ideal hiding place for mother and son? It didn't take me long to get cleaned up and in reasonable shape. They had been with me for 6 months now, with no appearances from Tom, and had finally started to relax, just a bit. Margaret had spent the last few days planning for Tanner's 10th birthday. They sat at the dining room table singing a song about an old man and his dog, making decorations out of old newspapers Margaret had found in my basement. It was the happiest I'd ever seen them, but that all changed when a loud knock came from the front door. Tanner looked at his mother with fear in his eyes. Margaret was clearly worried, her voice trembling as she sent Tanner to his room. She had put on a brave face, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Tanner could only muster a deep sigh before he reluctantly followed her instructions. He headed up the stairs, leaving the foreboding aura of the unknown looming behind him. Margaret didn't have a chance to open the door. Rather, a man who I recognized only from a box of photos she kept in her bedroom closet burst through the door and stumbled drunkenly into my hall. The energy that came off him was a repulsive cloud of pure evil. It clung to my walls like the cobwebs Margaret had spent so much time removing when they first arrived. "Tom?" He yelled and screamed, demanding that Tanner come to him this second. Margaret begged and pleaded with him just to talk to her, let her explain and leave their son out of it. Despite Margaret's attempts to reason with him, Tom's fury still blazed. He lashed out in frustration, slapping his wife across the face before pulling a gun out of the back of his pants and aiming it at Margaret's head. "Upstairs!" he shouted, swinging the gun wildly toward the stairs. The air was filled with tension and fear as Margaret slowly ascended the stairs with her husband, his gun gripped tightly in his hands. I could tell she was doing her best to keep him calm and focused on just her, hoping to avoid any further outbursts. She led him down the corridor, past Tanner's room, and into her own bedroom. But no sooner did the door close behind them, a loud bang reverberated through the hall. shaking my windows. Within seconds, Margaret came staggering back out of the bedroom, blood pouring from a gaping wound in her stomach. Tom followed closely behind her. Tanner huddled in his bedroom doorway as his mother stumbled past. Tom grabbed and spun Margaret by the arm before taking her by the throat. He held her captive, teetering over the top step of the long staircase. This all happened so fast. All I could do was watch in horror as Margaret clawed at her husband with blood-stained hands, desperate to break free. An eerie smile spread across Tom's face as, without warning, he released his hold. Her face contorted in terror as the realization hit. His grip was all that stood between her and gravity's pull. As if in slow motion, Margaret managed one final glance at Tanner before plummeting down the stairs. She landed at the bottom in a tangle of broken limbs, her neck bent awkwardly to one side. Blood began to pool, its warmth seeping into the hardwood floors beneath her lifeless body. I could feel Margaret's anger and pain flowing through me with every drop of her blood I absorbed. Her desperate need to save her son became my own. Tom's focus then turned to Tanner, and something snapped inside of me. My walls reverberated with a scream that couldn't possibly be mine, yet it flowed out from deep within me in a tidal wave of grief and hatred. Tanner backed into his room, away from his father as he approached. His bright blue eyes were wide with fear, and his hands shook as he clasped them tightly over his ears to block out the sound. Tom wouldn't take another step towards his son. I could sense Margaret's presence getting stronger by the second, filling every part of me as we became one. Tanner's door slammed, closing him off from what was about to come. He had already seen too much for someone so young. The floorboards buckled under Tom's feet, refusing to allow him to move forward. I could feel Margaret's strength, her determination, her love for her son, all of it coursing through me. Losing his balance, Tom's head hit the banister with a loud crack that filled me with a new sense of power. No! Margaret's scream came with a new explosion of energy that sent Tom stumbling further down the narrow corridor. The force of Margaret's scream was so strong that it caused the oil lantern to flicker and grow brighter, as if it were being amplified by her voice. With another uncontrollable cry, the lantern was flung off its table, smashing against Tom's chest and setting him ablaze. Tom screamed as the flames licked his skin, reaching out to consume him. He tried to run, but suddenly Margaret appeared, blocking his way, her dead eyes staring at him coldly. He stumbled backwards, tripping over a chair and falling towards the window at the far end of the corridor. The glass shattered as he hit it, and he tumbled out, his body now engulfed in flames. Margaret watched dispassionately as he fell, his screams echoing in the night. Finally, Tom was silent, his charred body lying still on the ground. Margaret turned away from the window, her work now done. She would never have to fear him again, and neither would Tanner. Tanner was taken into protective custody soon after that fateful night, and I think of him often. I still feel Margaret here with me, though I haven't seen her since that night. I still feel Margaret here with me, though I haven't seen her since that night. The small town has seen many changes during the last 25 years, and I even had a makeover in preparation for my incoming owners. A newly hung sold sign now sits in my freshly manicured yard. I'm nervous as the minivan stops at the end of my brand new driveway, but that nervousness turns to joy as a familiar blonde-haired man with piercing blue eyes walks toward me, his pregnant wife and 2 kids in tow. Tanner? I heard Margaret whisper. He's home. Sometime last year, I was driving down a dark, winding road. The only sound I could hear was the faint screeching of my car tires on the pavement. The trees on either side of the road were shrouded in darkness. I could barely see where I was driving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, my car engine sputtered and died. I was plunged into complete silence. As I tried to start the car, it just wouldn't budge. I was completely and utterly alone, only surrounded by darkness. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed that the trees were decorated with chains and candles, giving the already creepy forest an even more unsettling atmosphere. I started walking, trying to find some sign of life, when seemingly in the distance, I heard whispers coming from the darkness. I stopped, trying to listen carefully, but the whispers became louder and closer, and they had turned into screams. I started to run, my heart pounding in my chest, when I saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was wrapped in tattered robes, its face hidden behind a hood. Its hand reached out towards me, beckoning me to come closer. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or even make a sound. But just then, in that moment, a bat flew past me, breaking the spell I seemed to be in, and I started running again, but faster this time, much faster. The road ahead of me became blocked by a group of crazed people with their hands outstretched and their eyes wild with madness. I tried to turn back, but I was already surrounded on all sides. I was trapped. The figures started closing in on me, their hands reaching. I closed my eyes and braced for the worst. But once I opened them again, I was back in my car, safely on my way home. I was never able to explain what happened on that dark, winding road, but I knew that I would never forget the feeling of fear and madness that had consumed me that night. There was once a TikToker named Luna69 who was very careful about their privacy. They never revealed too much personal information and only made videos with their friends, never showing their face. However, one day they noticed that someone had been following their every move. They started receiving messages from an intruder who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. Luna69 became scared and started to look for ways to protect themselves. They made sure all of the windows and doors in their home were locked and even got a baseball bat and gloves to keep by their side while they slept. They made sure all the windows and doors in their home were locked and even got a baseball bat and gloves to keep by their side while they slept. One night, as they were sleeping, they were suddenly awoken by the sound of their fridge being smashed. They grabbed their baseball bat and cautiously approached the kitchen, only to find that the door was broken and the intruder had entered their home. The TikToker realized that the intruder had somehow hacked into their GPS and was using it to track their every move. Frightened, they quickly grabbed their phone and started to record a TikTok video, hoping that someone would see it and help them. In the video, they showed the broken door and the intruder who was slowly advancing towards them, holding a piece of ice. And all of a sudden, the intruder revealed themselves to be a stalker who had been watching them for a very long time, using the information from their TikTok videos to track their movements. Luna69 tried to run, but the stalker was too quick. They managed to get on a bus, but the stalker was right there behind them. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, the TikToker started to film the stalker, hoping that someone would recognize them. The video showed the stalker peeking over the chair wearing glasses and holding pictures and a newspaper. Luna69 was trapped with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The video abruptly ended and no one ever heard from them again. To this day, their fate remains a mystery, and their TikTok account serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of oversharing on social media. When I was younger, I was absolutely obsessed with looking perfect on TikTok. I was never quite satisfied with my own looks and constantly compared myself to others on the app. One day, I heard about a plastic surgery clinic that was rumoured to give people the perfect face, so reluctantly I decided to give it a try. The clinic was run by an old Asian lady who promised to make my face perfect. I was hesitant at first, but the old lady convinced me by saying, "Don't you want to have the confidence to post TikTok videos without feeling self-conscious?" I agreed, and the surgery began. The next thing I knew, I was in a dark room with needles in my face and my skin being stretched. The old lady was chanting in a strange language as she worked, and I could hear the sounds of my skin being cut and sewn. I tried to scream, but I was paralyzed and couldn't move. Days went by, and I finally woke up. But I was horrified by what I saw in the mirror. My skin was now a pale, translucent colour, and my eyes and nose were distorted. I tried to leave the clinic, but the door was locked, and the old lady was nowhere to be found. I soon realised that I had not been given Botox, and that the old lady was a demon in disguise. The demon had promised to make me beautiful, but instead had taken my face and given me a new one, an uglier one. I was trapped in the clinic, and every day the demon would come to me, giving me more needles and skin treatments. I was terrified and didn't know how to escape. A nurse came looking for a missing surgeon one day. I told the nurse what had happened, and she quickly called the police. When the police arrived, they found my original face in a jar, and the demon was never seen or heard from again. I was eventually able to have my face restored, but I was never quite the same again. I had lost all of my confidence, and was always reminded of the demon's cruel trick every time I looked in the mirror. After that, I never went near a plastic surgery clinic again, and always made sure to be careful who I trusted with my face. Back when I was in high school, I guess you could have called me a TikTok star. I was famous for my comedic skits and dance videos. To be honest, I loved the attention and the money that came with my newfound fame. But it all changed one day when I found myself trapped in a very dangerous situation. It all started with a net. I woke up one morning to find that I had been bound by a strong net that prevented me from moving. I was disorientated and confused, and I didn't know what was happening. Suddenly, I heard a voice that told me that I had been given a medicine that would make me perform better in my videos. I did not remember agreeing to take this medicine. The voice also told me that if I wanted to be free, I had to make a series of videos for them. I was rather skeptical at first, but as I started to feel the effects of the medicine, I realized that I had no choice but to comply. I started to make the videos, but they became more and more dangerous. I was told to climb tall buildings, jump off bridges, and even walk on tight ropes. I was terrified, but I had to do what I was told or I would never be free. One day, I was told to put on a pair of special socks and hold onto a bunch of balloons. I was so confused, but again, I didn't have a choice. I was told to jump off a tall building, and so I did. But as soon as I let go of those balloons, I started to fall, tumbling towards the ground. I was sure that I was going to die. I closed my eyes and I prayed, but then all of a sudden, I found myself back in my room, with my brother by my side. He told me that I had been in a coma for weeks and that he had been taking care of me. I was shocked and confused. But to be honest, I was just glad to be alive. I later found out that I had been in a machine that was designed to give people a taste of fame and fortune. The machine had been controlled by someone who was obsessed with fame and was using it to exploit others. I was lucky to have escaped, but I was left with a deep sense of caution about the dangers of fame and fortune. From that day on, I was always skeptic about the whole TikTok thing. I never trusted anyone again. I also started to appreciate the little things in life, like my family, my friends, or even the rain. I was always fascinated by TikTok and the endless possibilities it offered for a creative expression. As a self-proclaimed tech enthusiast, I loved experimenting with new filters and effects to make my videos stand out. That's why, when I came across a filter that claimed to bring my imagination to life, at first, everything seemed rather normal. The filter added a dreamy, surreal quality to my videos that I found incredibly cool. I quickly gained a following, with people praising me for my unique and captivating content. However, as time went on, I started to notice something was off. The world around me would suddenly become blurry and distorted, and I would find myself losing consciousness for a few seconds at a time. I tried to explain what was happening to me, but no one believed me. My friends and family thought I was just being dramatic, but I knew something wasn't right. There was this one day, while I was recording a video in my backyard, that I heard a loud, horrifying noise coming from my neighbour's house. I looked over to see their tennis court melting into a crooked mess. I was beyond scared. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the fear coursing through my veins. I ran back into my house, but the filter's effects followed me. I could still see the frightening, distorted world around me, even though everything appeared normal to everybody else. I immediately went to see a doctor, but they couldn't find anything physically wrong with me. It wasn't until I did some of my own research that I discovered the filter was affecting my mind and causing these strange hallucinations. I realized that I had to stop using it immediately to avoid any more harm. I never used TikTok again. The thought of experiencing those terrifying hallucinations once more was just too much for me to bear. I made it my mission to spread awareness about the dangers of letting technology mess with our imagination and the rest of our minds. I shared my story with others, warning them of the potential dangers of using certain filters and effects without fully understanding the consequences. I learned that sometimes the things we find most appealing can also be the most harmful, and it's important to be mindful of the technology that we choose to engage with. My name's Jack. I'm a TikTok creator who loves making videos with my dog Rusty. We live in a small town near a bridge that crosses a river. One day, I heard about a haunted basement beneath the bridge. Despite my friends' warnings, I was determined to make a TikTok video in the basement and prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. As we approached the bridge, Rusty started to bark and refused to go any further. I had to carry him down the steps to the basement. Once inside, I flicked on the switch, but the lights, they wouldn't come on. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight and I started to film. As I explored the basement, I heard strange noises and felt a strong sense of evil in the air. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut and I was plunged into complete darkness. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I started to panic and my phone battery was running low. As the light on my phone flickered, I heard a strange whispering and felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I realized that I was not alone in the basement, and something sinister was about to happen to me. The noises became more and more disturbing, and I felt as if I was being watched. In a moment of desperation, I called out for Rusty. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard a bark, and the door slowly creaked open. I ran out of the basement and back up to the bridge, where I was reunited with Rusty. From that day on, I never went near the haunted basement again, and warned others not to go there. The strange noises and disturbances still continue to this day, and it remains one of the most haunted places in my town. When I was younger, I was part of a group of friends who absolutely loved to make scary TikTok videos. They were always on the lookout for new ideas to shock their followers to gain more likes. One day, one of them came up with an idea for a prank that involved a sausage, a clown mask, and a deserted train station. The plan was rather simple. One of my friends would dress up in a clown mask and carry around a sausage pretending to chase the others through the train station. Quite a random idea, I know, but trust me, it was funny. They would then post the video on TikTok and see the reactions of their followers. However, things quickly took a bad turn once they arrived at the train station. As they walked in, they were greeted by a strange, eerie atmosphere that filled them all with dread. The clouds overhead looked ominous, and there was just a strange feeling in the air. As they started filming the prank, one of the friends tripped and fell, causing the clown mask to fall off. To their horror, they realized that the clown mask was actually a real clown's mask, and the sausage was actually made from human flesh. Panicked, they tried to run, but they were suddenly trapped by an unknown force. The air around them began to turn colder and colder, and they felt like they were slowly being frozen solid. Just when they thought they were done for, a man appeared, offering them a way out. He told them that the clown mask was part of a dark ritual that had gone very wrong, and that they had been summoned to play a part in it. My friends didn't waste any time. They ran as fast as they could, tripping and falling all the way. They finally made it to a nearby restaurant, where they collapsed in exhaustion. When they looked outside, they saw the flowers in the window were wilted, and this was when they knew that they had narrowly escaped a fate much worse than death. I sit in my cell, surrounded by the stench of sweat and filth. The sounds of shouting and pounding on metal fill the air, making it nearly impossible to think. I'm scared, constantly on edge, and feeling the pressure of this life bearing down on me. I was convicted of a crime I did not commit, but the evidence was stacked against me, and the jury found me guilty. I was thrown into this hellhole, a place where I am constantly pushed and shoved by other prisoners. The nights are the worst. The shaking of the bars as the deranged prisoners pound on them, the angry shouting and cursing that never seems to stop, and the fear that any moment could be my last. I have seen the violence in this place, the beatings and the hard, cold cell floors stained with blood. I'm a caged-like animal, with no windows to the outside world, and no hope of escape. I have tried to keep my sanity, to hold on to the person I once was, but it is becoming more and more difficult with each passing day. The conditions here are inhumane, the air thick with the stench of decay, and the constant noise driving me to the brink of madness. I am surviving, but barely. The thought of spending the rest of my life in this cage is a constant weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I pray for release, for justice, but it seems that hope is a luxury I can no longer afford. I am trapped in this prison, surrounded by the worst of humanity, and I fear that I too will become just like them. The lines between right and wrong are becoming blurred, and I am scared that I will not be able to hold on to my humanity for much longer. I was always somewhat of a wild child, always looking for a good time and never thinking about the consequences. But that all changed one night when I was arrested for drunk driving. I was so drunk that I couldn't even remember getting behind the wheel, and the police found me passed out in the car with an open bottle of whiskey on the passenger seat. When I sobered up, I was taken to jail, and I was in for a rude awakening. The cells were dirty and cramped, the guards were mean and always shouting, and the other prisoners were even worse. They were a rough crowd, and I was quickly outnumbered. I tried to keep to myself, but that only made things worse. The other prisoners started taunting me, hollering and spitting in my direction. I was way in over my head, and I knew it. I was facing serious charges and a very long sentence, and I was completely alone. I tried to argue with the police, but they wouldn't listen to me. I lied to them, telling them that I wasn't drunk, that I had just fallen asleep in the car. But it was no use. They had all the evidence that they needed. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I was transferred to a maximum security prison and put on death row. I was surrounded by the worst of the worst, and I was scared out of my mind. Every night I would lie in my cell, listening to the sounds of the other prisoners shouting, laughing, and psyching each other out. But then, something strange happened. A new prisoner was brought in. He was a big man with mean eyes and a rough demeanor. But for some reason, he took a liking to me. He showed me the ropes and taught me how to survive in prison. I was grateful for his help, and I started to feel like I had a shot at making it out of here alive. However, I quickly realized that my new friend was not what he seemed. He was playing me, using me to get what he wanted. One night he set me up, and I was beaten within an inch of my life. I was left lying on the floor, broken and bloody, with the other prisoners just laughing and shouting insults at me. From that day on, I was a changed man. I had seen the worst that the world had to offer, and I knew that I never wanted to go back to that place again. I served my time, but the scars of my time in prison will never fully heal. I will never forget the shouting and the hollering, and especially the spitting, and I will never forget the mean eyes of the man who changed my life forever. To this day, I still have trust issues and struggle to fall asleep at night. One day I was assigned to cover a story about a notorious prison in my area. The prison was known for its high security measures and was considered one of the most secure facilities in the country. As I entered the prison, I noticed a man who had just come in from a different newspaper. He was dressed in a suit and was carrying a briefcase. I assumed he was there for some kind of business, but little did I know, this man was actually a devious ex-convict who had managed to deceive everyone with his disguise. The man approached me and introduced himself as a freelance photographer who was there to cover the story with me. He said that he needed the money and that he was a professional in his field. At first, I was intrigued by this man, and so decided to work with him. As we started to work on the story, I quickly realized that this man was very intelligent. However, I started to notice a few odd details. There was something about his glasses and his moustache that just didn't look right, and his hair always seemed to look the same, but nonetheless, he was still very convincing in his disguise, and at no point did I ever think about potentially asking him if he had a wig or if these were his real glasses. So we continued to explore the prison. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something was off about this man. I decided to do some digging and discovered that he was actually an ex-convict who had served time in the same prison that we were covering. I found this interesting, and after further reading, I realised that he had lied about his identity, and it was now clear to me that he was using his skills to gain access to sensitive information. I was horrified and immediately reported what I had found to the authorities. The man was then arrested and taken back into custody. It turned out that he had a devious plan to break out of the prison and had been using his disguise to gather information that would help his escape. I was shocked, although I wasn't too surprised. This experience taught me to always be vigilant and to trust my instincts. I learnt that people can be deceptive and that it's important to always do your own research before trusting anyone. 30 years ago, I was sent to prison for a crime that I'd rather not go into too much detail about. Let's just say there was a woman who unfortunately lost her life, and I was to blame. The prison I was sent to was known to be one of the harshest and most inhumane in the country. The air was thick with the smell of fear and desperation, and every day felt like a living nightmare. I had a few friends in there with me though, and we tried to stick it out together and support each other. But the prison, it was designed to break us apart. The guards would constantly try to turn us against each other, offering us privileges if we ratted on each other. But we were stronger than that. We held on to our friendship like a lifeline. There was this one time, a fellow prisoner managed to smuggle in a piece of paper and a pen. He passed it to me and whispered, "Pass it on." The note had a message written on it. It was a set of coordinates and a basic salary. I didn't know what it meant at first, but I passed it on to the next person as instructed. The next day I was in the kitchen, working, when I heard a loud smash. I turned around to see one of my friends, covered in blood, frantically waving a weapon around. He had broken one of the plates and used a shard to stab one of the guards. The other prisoners were in a state of panic. Cutlery was scattered all over the place, and the blood was everywhere. I was frozen with fear as I watched my friend being taken down by the other guards. He was screaming. I had to do it. I later found out that the coordinates on the note were a location where a weapon was hidden, and the basic salary was an amount of money that was meant to be paid to whoever retrieved it. The victim of the attack, unfortunately, died, and my friend was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reality of life in prison hit me like a ton of bricks. The thought of spending the rest of my days in this place filled me with dread. I learnt a lesson that day, to never take my friendship with other prisoners for granted. We stuck together, and we continued to stick together and watch each other's backs. That was the only way we were ever going to survive in that hellhole. The prison may have broken us physically, but it could never break our spirits. And here I am today, a free man. Unfortunately, none of my friends made it out. But there are a few that are still alive, and I'll send a note every once in a while. I have been a tenant now, as a prisoner in a maximum security prison, for the last 10 years, serving time for a crime that I, of course, didn't commit. After all, everyone that's in prison is innocent, right? Every day is a living nightmare. There's an evil guard who enjoys tormenting and beating all of us. I often find solace in the moments where I'm actually able to light a cigarette and blow out the smoke, as if it were a way of letting go of the fear and anxiety that consumes me every day. But even those moments are taken away from me. I remember a time when the guard caught me and made me line up with the other prisoners, and then proceeded to throw rocks at us until we started to bleed. I was filled with a burning desire for revenge, and eventually, I finally got my chance. I managed to knock the guard out and took him as a hostage, threatening to torture him if he didn't confess to his wrongdoings. He begged and pleaded for forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. After what felt like hours of pleading and bargaining, the guard finally admitted to his crimes and I let him go. The word spread quickly and he was fired from the prison for the way he was treating us prisoners, and he never worked in a correctional facility again. But I was given an extra 10 years on top of my sentence, so every day I wonder whether or not it was worth it. But I tell you this, it felt good. I was one of those prisoners that had always been in and out of prison for years. I would serve my time, get out, and then within a few weeks, sure enough, I'd be caught for another crime and thrown back behind bars. But this time was different. I was determined to escape and clear my name. One night, I managed to slip out of my cell and make my way to the perimeter of the prison. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was far away from the prison walls. I knew the police would be after me, so I needed to find a place to hide. I stumbled upon a laundry room and quickly climbed into a basket full of dirty clothes, pulling the lid over me. I could hear the sirens getting closer, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the vibrations of the police cars as they drove by, but thankfully, they didn't stop. As soon as the coast was clear, I made a break for it. I stole a car and started driving as fast as I could, trying to put as much distance between me and the prison as possible. But the rain was coming down in sheets and the roads were slick. I could hear the sirens getting closer, and I knew I was running out of time. I was driving too fast, skidding around corners and almost losing control of the car. I was so scared that I was shaking, but I kept going. I looked back in my rearview mirror and saw the police cars closing in on me. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but it was no use. They were gaining on me, and there was nothing I could do. Just as I thought I was going to be caught, a truck appeared out of nowhere and slammed into the side of my car. The impact sent me spinning out of control, and I hit a guardrail. I was unable to move. The police cars pulled up behind me, and I knew it was over. I was arrested and taken back to prison. I was charged with manslaughter for the truck driver's death, and my sentence was extended. I was sad and defeated, knowing that I would be behind bars for the rest of my life. But at least I had tried, and that was something. I was once a prisoner, locked away in a maximum security prison for a crime I didn't commit. The place was known for its brutal conditions and the harsh treatment of its inmates. Every day was a struggle for survival. I spent my days working in the workshop, trying to pass the time as best I could. But even that was dangerous, with inmates forming gangs and fighting over the most trivial of things. I kept to myself, trying not to draw attention, but I was small and weak, and that made me an easy target for the stronger, more aggressive inmates. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, fearful of the next attack. One day, while I was in the library trying to escape my troubles, I heard a commotion coming from outside. I cautiously approached the door and peered through the tiny window. To my horror, I saw several escapees splashing through the puddles, exchanging punches with the guards. I was paralyzed with fear, wondering if they would come for me next. But then I heard a voice behind me. "Come on, we need to get out of here." It was one of my enemies, offering me a chance to escape. I didn't trust him, but I didn't have much choice. We made our way to the prison yard, dodging guards and ducking behind buildings. I'm not sure what drove me to do it. Maybe after all those years locked away, I couldn't help but jump at the chance to escape, even though I knew it wasn't going to end well. Nevertheless, eventually we made it to the fence, and I scrambled over it as fast as I could. I was free, but I was also scared. I didn't know what laid ahead, but I was determined to start a new life and leave my past behind. So here I am. I'm still on the run, but my life hasn't been as glamorous as I'd hoped. Every day I'm peering over my shoulder. Every day is another struggle for survival. Just like when I was in prison. I wouldn't wish this life on my worst enemy, but if I am caught, I fear what the police will do to me. Maybe this time I won't be locked away. Maybe this time my life will really be in danger. I was always an avid fan of anime, especially the ones with cute girls with big expressive eyes. One day I met a girl who shared my love for anime, and we quickly hit it off. We would spend hours discussing our favourite shows and characters, and I was smitten. We started flirting, and before I knew it, she was asking me out on a date. I was over the moon, and I felt like the luckiest person in the world. We went to an anime convention together, and it was the best day of my life. She was everything I wanted in a girl, and I just couldn't believe my luck. But then, something started to feel off. Her hands were always touching me, even when it wasn't necessary. At first, I didn't mind, but as time went on, the touches became more painful. She was always so strong, and it felt like she was trying to hurt me. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting harder and harder to do so. One day, she invited me to her apartment, and I felt nervous, but also excited. When I got there, I realised that something was very wrong. The place was a mess, and she had a deranged, manic look in her eyes. She was covered in makeup, and it looked like she'd tried to make herself look like an anime character. I was so scared, and I knew I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. But she was just too strong. She started talking to me in a voice that wasn't hers, and I realised that she had completely lost touch with reality. I was terrified, and I felt like I was in a nightmare. I tried to escape, but she was too fast. She kept coming at me, and I was so scared that I thought I was going to die. I thought I was done for, but then, suddenly, she stopped. She looked at me with a sad expression and whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." And then she was gone. I never saw her again. It was a tragic, sad ending to what had started as the most amazing thing that had ever happened to me. I learned that things aren't always what they seem, and that sometimes the people we care about the most can be the ones who end up hurting us. My love for anime started when I was a young boy, and it has never faded. I've watched countless animes and read even more manga. It was my escape from the real world, and I loved every minute of it. However, my love for anime would eventually lead me down a dark path that would change my life forever. One day I was in a dark alley when I was approached by a human trafficker. I didn't know it at the time, but they had offered me a job at a factory that made plastic figures for anime fans. I jumped at the opportunity because it would allow me to be surrounded by the things that I love the most. But little did I know that I was walking into a living nightmare. When I arrived at the factory, I was immediately put to work. I was painting figures all day, every day. The paint was toxic, and I was not given any protective gear. I started to feel sick, but I didn't dare to speak out. I needed this job to survive. We had to sleep in the factory. At 6 o'clock, the lights would go out, and we'd all huddle together in the corner of the room. One day, I was in the back room, looking for supplies, when the door locked behind me, and I found myself a prisoner of a dark room. I was terrified. I waited and waited, and the days ticked by, when eventually I was rescued by a group of people who had been looking for me the entire time. They told me that the factory was a front for a human trafficking ring, and that I was lucky to be alive. I was grateful to be rescued, but the experience had left a deep scar on me. I had seen dead bodies and encountered enemies who wanted to harm me. I was in a constant state of danger, and I felt like I couldn't trust anyone. After I was rescued, I needed to see a doctor to help me cope with what I had gone through. The doctor told me that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He prescribed me medication to help me sleep and advised me to seek therapy. I managed to find a new job, but I felt alone. One day I was humiliated in front of everyone I knew. Someone had spread rumours about me, and I was being mocked and ridiculed. I felt like I was being transformed into someone I didn't recognise. I was no longer the simple anime fan I used to be. I was a broken and traumatised person who was struggling to find any meaning in life. I eventually found solace in helping others who had been through similar experiences. I became an advocate for human rights and worked to bring attention to the issue of human trafficking. I may have lost my love for anime, but I found a new purpose in life that gave me hope and strength. I heard about a new comic book store opening up in town. I'm an avid fan of anime and comic books, so I was excited to check it out. The store was located in a secluded part of town, but I wasn't too worried. After all, I was an adult and I could take care of myself. But little did I know, the owner of the store was not at all what he said he was. When I arrived at the store, he stared at me, luring me into the basement with promises of rare collectibles. And once I was down there, he locked the door behind me, and that's when he revealed his true intentions. Before I knew it, I was a hostage, and I was a prisoner in the basement of the new comic book store. Days turned into weeks. Eventually, my hunger turned to starvation, and the only sustenance I had was the occasional stale cracker or sip of water given to me by my captor. The winter was the worst time. It was so harsh, and I was freezing, huddled into a corner, trying to keep warm any way I could. The only source of light that came was from a small crack in the bricked-up window, and it was quickly fading as the sun would set. I knew I had to find a way out, but the door was heavily locked, and the window was too small for me to fit through. I was running out of options. One day, I noticed a loose brick in the wall. I started to dig, using my bare hands to break through the cracks. It took me hours, but finally, I saw the light of day. I managed to squeeze my body through the tight gap. As I hadn't eaten for weeks, I was just about small enough to fit. I was finally free, but my freedom was short-lived. During my escape, my captor had heard the commotion and was now chasing after me. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was miles away. I'll never forget that experience. It still haunts me to this day. But I survived, and that's what matters. I hope that by sharing my story, I can prevent others from falling victim to the same fate. Never trust a stranger. For as long as I can remember, I've always been a huge anime fan. I've always loved to cosplay and attend conventions and immerse myself in the whole world. One of my favourite events is to attend Comic-Con, where I can indulge in my love for comic books, artwork, and everything in between. I was especially excited for this year's event, as I had been planning my cosplay for months. The day of the convention, I arrived early and made my way to the exhibition hall. As I walked through the crowds, I noticed a strange energy in the air. The atmosphere was tense and disturbed, as if something was off. I brushed it away, thinking it was just my imagination, and continued to enjoy the event. However, as the night progressed, things started to become more and more miserable. I looked out, and the stars in the sky were obscured by a thick layer of clouds, making it difficult to see. The darkness was pitch black, and I felt as though I was walking through a nightmare. I tried to find my friends, but they were nowhere to be found. As I was walking down a quiet hallway, I stumbled upon a broken door handle. I pushed the door open and was met with a disturbing sight. The room was filled with furries and anime fans, but their faces were twisted into expressions of fear and terror. I quickly realized that something was very wrong, and that I needed to leave immediately. I tried to find my way back to the exhibition hall, but the building seemed to be shifting and changing as if I was walking through a maze. Every door I tried was locked, and I was trapped. I felt like I was being watched, as if someone, or something, was following me. I then heard a sound behind me, and turned to see a figure in a ninja outfit. The figure approached me, and I realized that I was face to face with a famous anime character come to life. The character whispered something in a language I couldn't understand, and I felt as though I was being pulled into a nightmare. Suddenly, everything had turned black, and I found myself falling deeper and deeper into an abyss. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. Had this all just been a bad dream? But even now, years later, I still get shivers down my spine whenever I think about that night. I've never attended a Comic-Con again, because the experience was just too disturbing. There's something about a Comic-Con exhibition hall that just seems to be too much, and whenever I approach one, I just can't seem to shake the feeling that someone's watching me, and I just know that they're waiting for me to return. I've always been fascinated by the world of anime. The thought of wielding a blade and fighting against the evil villains has always been a fantasy of mine. One day, I decided to take a trip to Japan to immerse myself in the culture and experience the world of anime firsthand. As I was walking through the dense forest, I stumbled upon a campfire. I decided to approach it, thinking that maybe I could find someone to guide me through this forest. But what I found was something straight out of a horror anime. There was a group of people huddled around the campfire, but the problem was, they were all dead. Their bodies were mutilated and the ground was stained with their blood. I couldn't believe my eyes and started to back away, but that's when I heard a strange voice. "Welcome to my world, anime fan," the voice said. I looked around, but I couldn't see anyone. The voice continued. "So, you think you know everything about swords, but you have no idea what true terror is." I started to run, but I couldn't seem to escape the voice. It followed me, taunting me with promises of death and destruction. I stumbled and fell, and that's when I saw the blade. It was a strange, cold weapon that seemed to glow in the darkness of the forest. As I reached for the blade, I had a vision. I saw myself fighting against the villain, defeating them, and saving the world from their evil ways. But just as quickly as the vision came, it disappeared, and I was back in the forest, alone. I picked up the blade and started to run again. This time, I felt empowered. I had a weapon, and I was no longer afraid. I came across the villain, and we engaged in a fierce battle. I swung the blade with all my might, and with each strike, I could feel the energy coursing through my veins. In the end, I emerged victorious. The villain was defeated, and I was hailed as a hero. But even as I basked in my glory, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was something strange about that blade. I returned home, but I couldn't stop thinking about the strange voice and the visions, and especially that cold, cold blade. I soon realized that the sword had taken over my life and was starting to consume me from the inside. To this day, I just seem to wander around, seeking out those who would challenge me, wielding the blade and fulfilling my destiny as a true anime hero. But with each victory, the blade consumes a little more of my soul. And to be honest, I do worry from time to time that I might just be losing my mind. I was an avid fan of anime, particularly ones that involved intense action and adventure. I had always been fascinated by the concept of karma and how it could dictate the consequences of one's actions. One day, I decided to take a break from my usual routine and explore a nearby mountain. As I was hiking, I came across a strange man wielding a bow and arrow. He was surrounded by a flame that seemed to be fueled by a dark energy, and his eyes were fixated on me. I knew I was in trouble and tried to run, but he was just too quick for me. He chased me through the mountain, and I stumbled upon a horse that seemed to be abandoned. I quickly jumped upon the horse and rode as fast as I could, but the man was still able to catch up. Just as he was about to collide with me, there was a sudden collapse, and the ground beneath me crumbled. I was able to grab onto a nearby branch, but the man and the horse were both swallowed by the darkness. Despite what had just happened, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being stalked by the man, and I decided to make my way back home as quickly as possible. However, the further I walked, the more the wildlife around me seemed to be dead, with flowers wilting and turning brown. I eventually came across a corpse, and I couldn't help but feel that it was a warning. I was consumed by fear and knew that I had to act fast. I realized that the strange man was seeking revenge for something I had done in the past, and I was now paying the price for those actions. The concept of karma was now becoming a reality for me. One day there was a knock at the door. They were two policemen. They didn't say much before they grabbed me. The next thing I knew, I was thrown into prison, where I was left to ponder my actions and the consequences they had brought upon me. I won't go into too much detail about the crimes of my past, but just know, these consequences were not a surprise, at least not to me. The flame that once surrounded the man that I saw that day still burned brightly in my mind, reminding me of the darkness that had consumed me, and still does to this day. I love to imagine worlds, the complex characters, and the intense action. Of course, I'm a huge anime fan. I love anime and manga. I don't know which one I prefer. However, there was one anime that I just couldn't seem to shake from my mind. It was a dark, scary story about a mysterious figure known only as the Fruit. I had a sweet tooth and was always looking for something new and sugary to eat, so when I stumbled upon a new fruit that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, I was ecstatic. It was shaped like a pear, but had a bright, glowing aura around it. I took a bite and immediately felt a wave of happiness wash over me. But as the happiness faded, I began to feel a strange sense of unease. My limbs felt heavy, and I had a hard time speaking. My thoughts became muddled, and I found myself struggling to focus on anything. I would always see that mysterious figure in my mind, and I knew I was in trouble. I woke up to find myself in a dark, cold room. I was lying on a hard metal floor, and my left eye seemed to be missing. My right leg was broken, and I was struggling to speak due to a lisp that had suddenly developed in my speech. I was also incredibly sweaty, and I had a feeling of desperation. The only thing I had with me was a rusty pickaxe and a drain pipe. I tried to use the pickaxe to break out of the room, but it was no use. The metal was too thick and strong. It was as if I was in some sort of game, but I had no idea how I'd got there, or any idea how to escape. As the days passed, I became increasingly uncomfortable, and I began to panic. I was given watered-down alcohol to drink one morning, and every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by that image of the fruit. I never understood where that name came from. It was just as mysterious as the figure himself. But one day, I heard a strange rustling noise, and as I looked out of the small window, I saw snowflakes falling from the sky. I was confused, as I was in a dark, underground room, and snow was the last thing I expected to see. But as the snowflakes landed on the floor, they turned into a horde of screaming creatures. I can't exactly remember how, maybe it was the trauma, but I managed to escape. But when I woke up, I was back in my own room, safe and sound. When I look back, I guess my theory is I fell asleep after watching a new anime, and then my mind just started to race. At least, I hope that's why, because the memory of that dark, terrifying experience still haunts me to this day. And no matter what, I can never look at fruit the same way again. I was just your casual anime fan. Nothing special. I loved watching the action, the drama, the thrill, and the excitement that each episode brought. However, my love for anime soon took a dark turn when I was caught up in the world of clan and gang violence. It all started when I stumbled upon a group of anime fans who were more into the darker side of things. They were into stuff like torture and fights, and their favourite of all, duels. At first I was skeptical, but their passion for the genre soon won me over, and I found myself drawn into their dark world. One day I was challenged to a duel by the leader of the group. Of course I was nervous, but there was also an excitement that passed through me. I had never been in a fight before, and the thought of testing my skills filled me with adrenaline. We decided that the duel will take place in the woods, with the rustling leaves and the barking of dogs as our only witnesses. The fight was brutal and intense. I remember feeling every strike, every punch and every kick. The pain was unbearable, but I refused to give up. I was fighting for my honor. I remember screaming at the top of my lungs, willing myself to keep going. But as the fight drew to a close, eventually, I emerged victorious. But at what cost? I was left with bruises and scars that would never fade. The physical pain was nothing compared to the mental toll that it took on me. I was haunted by the memories of the fight and the violence that I had been a part of. I didn't know who I was anymore. I eventually realized that the love for anime should not come at the cost of others. The thrill and excitement should not be achieved through violence and harm. I left the group and tried to put the past behind me, but those memories and the pain still lingered. I may have been an anime fan, but my love for the genre was forever tarnished by the violence and the pain that came with it. I never imagined that a peaceful fishing trip could turn into a terrifying ordeal. I had been walking through the woods for a while, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of the leaves rustling under my feet. The sun was setting, and I decided to stop by a small pond to cast my line. As I was waiting for a fish to bite, I heard a faint growl in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it. A huge, furry bear emerging from the trees. Its big black eyes stared at me, and I froze in fear. The bear was massive, easily towering over me. Its teeth were sharp and menacing, and it emitted a deep rumble that shook the ground beneath me. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt heavy as lead. I started to back away slowly, hoping to escape without drawing the bear's attention. But as soon as I moved, the bear charged at me with incredible speed. I ran as fast as I could, feeling the bear's hot breath on the back of my neck. I could hear the bear's heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. I was running out of breath and knew that I couldn't keep up the pace for much longer. As I stumbled through the bushes, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. The bear had caught up to me and bitten me. I screamed in agony and fell to the ground, feeling the bear's massive paws pressing down on me. I could see its black eyes staring at me, and I knew that this was it. I closed my eyes, waiting for the bear's final blow. But then, I heard a loud bang, and the bear slumped to the ground, motionless. I opened my eyes to see a group of hunters approaching, with their guns smoking. They had come to my rescue, just in time. As I was taken to the hospital to treat my wounds, I couldn't shake off the memory of that terrifying encounter with the bear. I knew I would never forget the sound of its growl or the sight of its huge furry body. From that day on, I made a vow to never venture out into the woods alone again. The mountain was silent, except for the sound of my footsteps crunching on the rocky ground. I had been hiking for hours, trying to reach the summit before nightfall. But as I reached a narrow pass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing there, at the other end of the pass, was a huge grizzly bear. Its fur was dark and matted, and its eyes glowed like two orbs of fire in the dim light. It stood on its hind legs, towering over me, and let out a low growl that echoed through the mountains. I was unable to move, or even breathe. The bear just stared at me with its big black eyes, and I could feel its breath on my face. I knew that this was it. I was going to be its next meal. But then, the bear did something unexpected. It turned around and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts and fears. I stood there for a while. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I wondered why the bear had spared me, and what other dangers lurked in the mountains. I continued on my hike, but the memory of the bear stayed with me, haunting me like a ghost. As I reached the summit and set up my tent, I couldn't shake off that feeling like I was being watched. I could hear strange noises in the distance, like I was being followed. The wind howled through the mountain, and the trees rustled like they were whispering secrets. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was the sound of something scratching at my tent. All I could hear was heavy breathing and the sound of claws scraping against the fabric. I reached for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I was all alone in the dark with whatever was outside of my tent, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat, when suddenly the scratching stopped, and the breathing grew fainter. I laid in my tent, shivering with fear, and after a while I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. The next morning I packed up my gear and made my way down the mountain. I never saw that bear again. But the memory of that eerie encounter stayed with me for a very long time, and it still does. I knew that the mountains held secrets and dangers that I could never fully understand, and that sometimes it's better not to poke the bear. My name is Charlie, and I'm here to tell you about the scariest day of my life. It all started when I was hiking in the woods with my dad. We were having a great time, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of nature. But then we heard something that made us freeze in our tracks. It was a growling noise, low and menacing. We looked around, trying to see where it was coming from. And then we saw it. A bear. Huge and terrifying, charging straight at us. My dad grabbed my hand and started running, but the bear was just too fast. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, with its eyes gleaming like hot coals and its fur standing on end. It was crazy, wild, and it was after us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we ran and my legs burning with exertion. I could hear the bear's heavy breathing and the sound of its claws scratching at the ground. My dad and I ran as fast as we could. But the bear was getting closer and closer. I could see the fear in my dad's eyes, and I knew that we were in serious trouble. But then, just as the bear was about to pounce on us, something incredible happened. Out of nowhere, a group of hunters appeared, armed with guns and shouting at the bear. The bear stopped, turned around, and charged at the hunters instead. They fired their guns, but the bear was too fast, too wild, and too crazy to be stopped. It tore through the group of hunters like they were nothing, leaving behind a trail of destruction and blood. I could hear their screams of terror and the sounds of bones breaking as the bear mauled them to bits. My dad and I ran as fast as we could, not daring to look back. We stumbled through the woods, not knowing where we were going and just trying to escape that bear's fury. But he was always there, chasing us. It was like it had become obsessed with us, like it would stop at nothing until it had caught us. And then, just when we thought we couldn't run any longer, something amazing happened. We stumbled upon a stream, and my dad had the idea to jump in and swim downstream. Well, we did just that, swimming as fast as we could, while the bear followed us along the banks, growling and snarling. Eventually the stream started to pick up pace, and the bear started to fall behind. We managed to lose the bear and made it back to civilization. But the memory of that crazy, wild and terrifying bear stayed with me forever. It was like a monster come to life, a force of nature that couldn't be stopped, and I knew that in the wilderness there were things that were beyond our control, beyond our understanding. I had always loved camping, and there was nothing more refreshing than spending a weekend in the forest, surrounded by nature. One particular weekend, a group of friends and I decided to go camping in a forest we'd never been to before. As we were setting up our tents, we noticed that the forest was unusually quiet. It was the calm before the storm. And we didn't know it yet, but we were about to experience something we would never forget. As we sat around the campfire that night, we decided to play some loud music. We were having a great time, and we didn't even realize that we were about to attract some unwanted attention. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, an enormous animal appeared through the bushes. We froze, not knowing what to do. It was at this moment we realized that this was a grizzly bear. It seemed calm at first, but as the music got louder, it started to get agitated. It began to rip our tents apart and started stealing our food. We soon realized that the bear wasn't just any ordinary bear. It was a mother bear protecting its cub, and it was terrifying. We tried to move away, but in our haste, I tripped over some logs and fell. I jumped up as quickly as I could, but the bear was already charging towards me. I thought it was the end for me, but luckily one of my friends managed to distract the bear, and it went after him instead. We all ran as fast as we could, but as we were running, we could hear the bear's loud growls and snarls behind us. It was pitch black, and we could barely see where we were going. We were all scared and in shock. We finally reached the safety of our cars and drove away as quickly as we could. That night was one of the scariest nights of my life, and I had nightmares about the bear for weeks after. It was a humbling experience, and I learned to always be cautious and respectful of nature. Me and my family were on a skiing holiday in Canada. It was a beautiful winter day, and we were all having a great time skiing down the snowy slopes. As we were skiing down one of the steeper hills, we suddenly heard a loud growl. We looked around, and to our horror, we saw a massive bear running towards us. We tried to ski away, but the bear was just too fast, and it quickly caught up. We were frightened and didn't know what to do. The bear suddenly swiped at us, and we dodged out of the way, but we were in real danger and needed to act fast. My dad shouted at us to ski towards the trees, hoping that they would block the bear's path. We all followed his lead and skied as fast as we could toward the trees. We could hear the bear's heavy breathing and loud snarls getting closer and closer. Just as we reached the trees, the bear instinctively stopped chasing us. It sniffed around and then turned and ran back into the forest. We were all relieved and grateful that we had managed to escape unscathed. After the incident, we made our way back to our cabin and reported the incident to the authorities. They told us that it was very rare for bears to attack humans and that we had just been really unlucky. We spent the rest of our holiday enjoying the skiing and taking in the beautiful scenery, grateful to have each other and to have survived that bear encounter. When I look back, although it was a scary experience, we emerged from it with a new sense of appreciation for nature and its unpredictability. We learned to be more cautious and respectful of wildlife, and to never take life for granted. The bear encounter was a reminder to cherish every moment and to never take our loved ones for granted. I'm a 20-year-old man, and I've been living through my basement for most of my life, as it's been a great spot to hang with my friends, watch movies, drink, etc. The basement is full of windows, and has a door that allows for easy entry and exit without detection from my parents, as it's far away from their bedroom. This basement has pretty much been the source of my social life, as my house has become a hub for my large circle of friends. The constant flow of people coming in and out has allowed me to become complacent with safety, as I often leave the shades open and door unlocked. I live in a nice neighbourhood, so I've never had any problems with it, and it makes it easier as I don't have to unlock the door every time someone comes over. I always knew there was a possibility that my laziness could cause a problem, but in all my years, nothing happened. Until recently. 3 weeks ago, when a friend of mine was leaving late at night, he texted me from his car that he had seen a faceless man standing near the street, but he disappeared upon second look. This scared the hell out of me, so I closed the blinds and locked the door, and I've left them like this ever since. Me and my friends have started making jokes about this faceless man, and I mostly forgot about it as I assumed it was just late and he had mistaken a mailbox or tree for a person. I once again got complacent and started leaving some blinds open again. Well, last night I had a girl over, and I was too distracted to realise that some of the blinds were open. Me and the girl had a good night, if you know what I mean, and she left around 1 AM. In the same fashion as 3 weeks ago, she texted me from the car, saying there was a man near the house, but he disappeared when she looked a second time. Suspicious this time, I investigated outside and found some footprints near the window. Their direction faced all over the place, so they could have been made by the girl or a friend from a different night. Still very suspicious, I went to the second floor and watched the area outside the window for a long time. Around 3 AM, I saw the man in the street, who appeared to be looking at me, but I couldn't quite tell. He walked closer to the house, but not right up to the window. He clearly realised the blinds were closed and walked towards the dark part of the street. I quickly ran to the door and yelled as loud as I could that I was calling the police. I didn't actually do it, but I planned to set up a trap tonight. I hate the idea that there could be someone watching every moment I spend with my friends, and especially that they could be watching me during my personal time. I will leave the blinds open and pillows that look like a person sleeping, while I get ready to capture him on camera and call the police. Regardless of the outcome, my blinds will never be open again. It was a dark and stormy night, and a woman named Sarah was driving home from work. As she drove through a remote wooded area, her car suddenly broke down. Sarah got out of the car and tried to call for help, but she had no cell phone service. She started walking in the direction of the nearest town, but she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her because of the heavy rain and the darkness. As she walked, Sarah heard a strange noise coming from the swamp nearby. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the noise grew louder and more distinct. She realized it was a scream. She tried to run in the opposite direction, but her feet sank into the muddy ground as she struggled to move. Suddenly, Sarah heard a sinister laugh coming from the swamp. She turned around and saw a figure emerging from the murky water. It was a man with a twisted, evil grin on his face. He was covered in mud and held a long, rusty knife in his hand. Sarah screamed and tried to run, but the man was too quick for her. He caught up to her and held the knife to her throat. Just when Sarah thought she was going to die, she heard the sound of a police siren in the distance. The man quickly disappeared into the swamp, and Sarah was finally rescued by the police. They searched the swamp, but never found the man or the knife. To this day, Sarah never forgot the scream and the laugh that she heard that night in the swamp. Some time ago, a friend of mine and I decided to do the Ouija board for the first time, something we had never dared do before. We called 2 other friends to come and do it with us, as I had been told that it was more likely something would happen if there were more people. We had a hard time convincing the other 2, but in the end they agreed to come along. We got everything ready, and feeling a bit nervous, we got started. During the session, one of the girls we had called to join us said, "This is nonsense, I'm out of here." We got a little scared and decided to leave it for another time. After a few days, the girl who had left called me, beside herself. She said that, as she was passing a derelict house near her home on the way back from the local library, a little girl dressed in white had asked to play with her. My friend told her that she couldn't, as she was in a hurry to get home, and immediately the girl began to cry tears of blood. My friend fled, and when she got home, she called me. At first, I thought she was pulling my leg, but something told me that this was not the case. I began to think about the day we'd done the Ouija board, and how abrupt my friend had been when she had to get up and leave. I didn't give it much more thought, and then I went to bed. The next day, my friend called me, because she was going to be home alone studying, and she was scared. She asked me to keep her company. I took a bus over to hers, and we settled down with our books. After a while, we heard a scratching noise behind us. We both looked up, and were horrified to find that the girl she had described to me was sitting on my friend's bed, scratching the wall. We ran out of the room, and when we got to the front door, I noticed that my friend was not there. But I was so terrified, I couldn't make myself wait for her. Shortly afterwards, the police called my house to tell me that my friend had died of an asthma attack. She had been found on the stairs of her house with a terrified expression on her face. For several months after that, I was in treatment. I am now recovering, but the other day, a note appeared in my mailbox, written in a little girl's hand that read, "Your friend died because she wouldn't play with me. I have a new doll." I think it's a joke, since our story has become famous in our town, but on the other hand, I'm scared. I wonder if she'll come for me. I was driving my car down a long road one day when I spotted a balloon floating in the distance. It was a bright red colour and seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. As I got closer, I noticed a clown holding the string, waving at me, with a sinister grin on his face. I tried to drive away, but my car, it wouldn't start. The clown slowly approached, still holding the balloon and grinning from ear to ear. Suddenly, I spotted a spider crawling out of the clown's shirt, and I knew that I had to get out of there. I managed to get out of the car and started running down the road, but the clown and the spider were always just a few steps behind. I could hear their sinister laughter echoing in the distance. Finally, I spotted a hosepipe lying on the side of the road, and I grabbed it, hoping it would serve as some sort of weapon against the clown and the spider. As I turned to face my pursuers, I suddenly found myself surrounded by a whole group of clowns, each one holding a balloon and also holding a spider. Just then, I heard a familiar voice calling out to me. It was my grandma, and she was pointing to a water fountain in the distance. I ran towards the fountain, with the clowns and spiders close behind, but as soon as I reached the fountain, I was enveloped by a bright light, and I knew that I was safe. It was my brother. He appeared beside me, and we hugged each other, grateful to be alive. We never spoke of the clowns, spiders, or balloons again, but the memory of that frightening experience will be something I think about till the day I die. Once, me and my friends were at the park and decided to walk to the creek nearby. We went to this small area that they had found a few years back. In the trees, in a small clearing, there was a mini living space type place. A desk, a couch, blankets, a tent, and a lot of garbage. They explained to me that there was a man who supposedly lived in there and always wore a purple blanket on his head. They called him Purple Do-Rag Man. We decided to start exploring the place. One day, we went over to explore more, and on the couch, we found fresh human spit. It hadn't even sunk into the couch yet. We were a bit creeped out, so we set people to guard outside, just in case. As we were exploring, we hear a noise in the bushes. One of the guards says he saw someone in the trees nearby. We had gathered a pretty large group by now, about 15 people, so we needed to find everyone and get them out, quick. We had split up, and it was a pretty complicated set of small paths. We had gathered most people, but there were still some missing. We called out, but couldn't find them. Finally, they run out of the trees, out of breath. "I think we saw Purple Do-Rag Man. Get out," they said. We all grabbed sticks, just in case, and I pulled out my phone, ready to call the police if we needed to. We sat outside the trees, at a good distance in the field, when we see an extremely tall man walk into the place. He was panting heavily and wearing a white t-shirt. He walked around the place a few times, sounding like he was trying to speak, but couldn't. Then we all ran away. My friends confirmed that the man we saw was him. No idea what he was doing there or what was up with him. The trees around the creek have since been cut down. The group says they had seen him early in the morning, sleeping on the couch. To this day, I wonder who he was. When I was younger, I was part of a group of friends. Peter, James, Colin, and me, Fred. One day, we decided to explore a creepy old hospital that was rumoured to be haunted. We had heard so many stories about strange noises and ghostly sightings that we couldn't resist the thrill of checking it out for ourselves. As soon as we stepped inside, we knew we were in for a frightening experience. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, and the walls were stained with years of neglect. We made our way through the darkened halls, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Suddenly, we heard a strange noise coming from one of the rooms. Peter, being the bravest of us all, decided to investigate. But as soon as he opened the door, he let out a blood-curdling scream. The room was filled with the ghostly apparitions of patients who had suffered and died there. Terrified, we ran out of the hospital as fast as we could, but the horror wasn't over yet. As we made our way to the shopping mall to calm our nerves, we encountered an old man with a creepy walking stick. The man seemed to be following us, and his stick made a strange, clacking sound as he walked. We tried to shake the man, but he was always just one step behind. Finally, we decided to confront him, but as soon as we turned around, he was gone. We searched the mall, but there was no sign of him anywhere. That night, as we were trying to fall asleep, we heard the same clacking sound of the walking stick. We knew that the old man was still following us, and that we were in grave danger. After that day, we never spoke of the old man or the hospital ever again, but that memory of the terror-filled experience stayed with me and all of us, forever. This is a true story about an anomalous occurrence that happened to me when I was younger. This is my first time talking about this. It happened on and off when I was a kid throughout my teenage years. I'm about 14 or 15 at the time. I live in a one-story house, 3 rooms and a bathroom on the side of the house, where my room is. It's midnight. The house is dark and quiet, except for the trickles of the fountain in my living room and the soft, dim haze of the nightlight in my hallway. I've woken up from a dream, still very out of it. But I still have my wits. I wander down the hall and flick on the light switch. Keep in mind, the nightlight is still on, yet the lights don't come on. Thinking something was off, as I've mentioned that this has happened often, I go to the office and flick the switch. Nothing. I tried every switch within the bathroom, the guest room, even my room. Still, nothing. At this point, I'm pretty freaked out and was going to seclude myself in my room. I got to the door frame of my room when I felt this looming void of energy around me. I wanted to speak, but I could not make a sound. I tried to force any type of cry or whimper. Nothing would come out. I tried to move, but felt petrified, almost like I was wearing cement shoes. I tried closing my eyes for a brief moment and telling myself it was just a dream, only to open them again and realize I was a part of a grim reality. Minutes seem like hours until I am finally able to move and speak. Shaken, I decided to head to bed because I thought that my parents would never believe me. Moments later, I still cannot sleep. I go to try the light switch. My light turned on. I sighed in relief. I decided to forget about what happened and just go to sleep. I don't know why this happens. Everything else that is electric powered in the house was still running. It hasn't happened since I was about 16, but I remember all the occurrences vividly. I know I wasn't dreaming or sleepwalking. Nevertheless, it still terrifies me to this day. So I have this friend, Ben, who loves to watch horror movies on Netflix late at night. One day, he stumbled upon a movie that was not listed in the usual catalogue, but instead, it had a strange URL. Intrigued, he decided to give it a try. As the movie started to play, Ben noticed that the characters on the screen were doing things that were exactly the same as what was happening in the room around him. The main character of the movie would look directly at the camera, almost as if they could see him watching. Ben tried to turn off the movie, but the power was out, and his phone was dead. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Ben felt a cold breath on his neck. He turned around to see a figure standing in the doorway, but before he could scream, the figure vanished into thin air. Ben tried to run, but the doors and windows were all locked from the outside. It had become apparent that he was trapped. The movie continued to play, and Ben realized that the events on the screen were a warning of what was to come. The main character was being chased by a monster, and Ben felt as if he was being hunted too. He knew he had to find a way out, but the more he tried to escape, the more the monster closed in. After that day, Ben was never seen or heard from again. Some say he is still trapped in that haunted movie, forever to be terrorized by the monster. Others say that he was actually transported into the movie, and that he's now living in a parallel universe. But one thing is for sure, I will never watch Netflix again. So, this happened to me when I was about 9 years old, in the apartment my family and I lived in before we bought a house. It was Friday night. My parents had decided that they wanted to go on a date, but instead of leaving me with a babysitter, like they always did, they just let me stay home alone. "You're old enough," my mother said. "You can take care of yourself alone." But, of course, they needed to give me the rules. No opening the door for anyone, no horror movies, and go to bed at 9 p.m. sharp. I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies back then because I would get really bad nightmares. Once my parents left, I watched TV until 9 and then went into my room, reading a book using the light from my nightlight. Before I continue, let me set the scene for you. When you first enter my room, you'd see that to the right was my bed, and at the very foot of my bed was a closet. So, if I were to sit up just a little from a back sleeping position, if the closet was open, I could see right in. At that time, I wasn't that afraid of leaving my closet open, so it was open tonight. After about 30 minutes, I closed my book, turned off my nightlight, and laid down. I was asleep for about an hour when I heard something moving around my room, specifically near the closet. I assumed it was just my parents returning from their date and checking in on me, so I went right back to bed. Then, 10 minutes later, I hear the sound again. Louder and closer this time. So, being the stupid kid I was, and assuming it was just our cat, I sat up slightly to look into the closet, and lo and behold, there was someone, or something, just inches inside the closet, staring at me. I couldn't make out any details, but the eyes were unforgettable. They were a pair of dim, white eyes. They had this gentle glow to them, and they swayed a bit, as if they were just floating. I didn't know what to do, so I just stared. Whatever it was continued staring right back at me. Then, after a moment, the eyes moved deeper into my closet, and just like that, they were gone. I can't really explain what it was that was in my closet, but it definitely wasn't a cat. My name's Connor. I'm just your average boy attending a school with a dark and mysterious history. Despite the rumours of strange occurrences, I was always drawn to the old building and loved to explore its hidden passageways and creepy classrooms. One day, during lunch break, I heard a strange siren coming from one of the classrooms. I cautiously approached the door and opened it, only to be met with a sinister sight. The room was filled with shadows, and the desks and chairs were arranged in a strange and ominous pattern. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room was plunged into darkness. I tried to find the light switch, but it was as if the room had taken on a life of its own. The shadows started to move, and the furniture began to creak and groan. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in the haunted classroom. The shadows took on the form of dark, twisted figures, and the noise grew louder and more frantic. I tried to escape, but the door was now locked from the outside. I was trapped. As the horrors of the haunted classroom closed in around me, I realized that this was not just any ordinary school. It was a place where the dead were trapped, unable to escape their torment. And now, I was one of them. I love my wife above all else. I have loved her since the moment I first laid eyes on her. I would do anything for her, and that has never changed after all of these years. We first met in college. We were both theater majors, and it was day one of Acting 1 class that our eyes met for the first time. She had chocolate brown eyes that were complemented by her dark brown curls. We stared at each other constantly that first day, and when we were partnered together, we knew that it was fate. My name is Margaret. she said to me as soon as I walked up to her after class. I took her by her hand and I kissed it. Henry, I responded. She then took one of my long dreadlocks and wrapped it around her finger, staring me in the eyes and biting her lip. It was an amazing meeting, with an even better ending later that night. The following night, we went on our first date, a theater production of Sueno. We held each other's hand through the entire performance, and afterward, I walked her to her dormitory. Every day after that was like a love story. We went through good times and bad times. We broke up and we got back together. Through it all, one thing never changed for me. I loved her and would do anything for her. We got married after graduation and went on to become very successful in the stage acting scene. We were considered a power couple and were always cast in romantic roles opposite each other. It was easy to bring the true deep love that we felt for each other to the stage, and it was nice to make money from it. One day, our lives took a turn. We had just finished a successful performance of the stage play, The Clean House, when we were approached by a member of the audience. "That was an amazing performance." "Why, thank you. You're sweet," said Margaret, gripping my hand. I could tell this guy had creeped her out, but being a talented actress, she was able to put on a nice front. "I've been watching you two for a very long time," he continued, his pale blue eyes staring into Margaret's. "I am very much a fan of your work. Every performance is riveting, and I can tell that you put true passion into your exchanges. You two truly must love each other." "We do," I said, stepping slightly in front of Margaret. "We love each other very much. I would do anything for her." I looked at her, and she gave me that beautiful smile of hers. "That warms my heart to hear," he said as he put his arms behind his back, and looking up into the night sky. "True love is a valuable gift that is often taken for granted. If you're not careful, you can easily lose it forever, and it can never be replaced, no matter how hard you try." He then looked at me, and I could see just how disturbing his pale blue eyes were. "Hold on to that gift. Cherish it forever." He began to walk away before I asked the question that had been bothering me since we met. "Who are you?" I yelled. He stopped and turned his head. "Your biggest fan." He then walked away. Margaret and I looked at each other, baffled at what had just taken place. Later that night, we were sitting on our couch watching a movie, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. "Wonder who that could be," said Margaret, as she got up to see who it was. She looked at the peephole and froze in place, before taking a single step back and opening the door. Standing just outside the door was the same man we had talked to earlier that night. He stood there, with his arms behind him, his pale blue eyes shining like the moon. "Honey?" I said, standing up from the couch to join Margaret at the door. "Please, come in," Margaret said to the man, to my shock. "What are you doing?" I yelled, running to get the door. The man stepped inside before I got there, and began to stroke her face. When I finally got to them, I threw my fist and connected with his face, knocking him back outside. I quickly slammed the door and locked it. I turned to Margaret, who was in some sort of trance. I tried to snap her out of it. "Margaret!" I yelled, shaking her. "Margaret, wake up!" There was nothing I could do to get her to respond. I shook her, slapped her, even splashed water in her face. Nothing would work. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. I looked around until I saw the silhouette of a man standing outside our living room window. I blinked, and it was gone. I began to panic and ran to the gun safe in our bedroom. Despite being theater nerds, we were very well trained in self-defense and firearms. We could each hold our own if our lives were in danger, and if there was ever a time to put that training to use, it was now. When I got back to the living room, I immediately raised my weapon. There stood the strange man, holding Margaret by the face. "Let go of her," I yelled, aiming for his head. He looked at me, and the only thing I could see in the darkness was glowing red eyes. He then turned his head to Margaret and I fired, hitting him directly in the head. He fell to the floor hard and I ran over. Margaret fell over too, but I caught her before she hit the ground. She still would not respond, her eyes wide open in a trance. I looked over to the man, but he was gone. I gently laid her on the floor and stood up quickly, readying my weapon once again. Suddenly, I felt a strong, tight grip on the back of my neck, and I was then thrown across the room, hitting the wall. I groaned in pain as I grabbed my gun and slowly stood to my feet, shaking as I raised my weapon again. He had a hold of Margaret, but this time he pulled her head close to his. I felt my heart race and my blood boil as he put her lips to his glowing red eyes staring at me. "No!" I screamed as I ran towards them. He then pushed her to the side and opened his arms to me, as if inviting me to fire on him again. I obliged and fired 5 rounds into him, but all he did was allow them to connect as he laughed. I ran up to him, but he grabbed me by the throat before I could do anything. He pulled me close to his face, and I could see every horrifying feature. Not only did he have demon-like eyes, but his face was covered in disgusting pulsating veins. In his mouth were 2 sharp fangs and a long slimy tongue, which rubbed against my face as if tasting me before taking his first bite. I lifted my gun to the arm that had a hold of me and fired twice. He growled in pain as he released me, and I connected the butt of my gun to his face repeatedly. He fell to the floor and I mounted him, smashing his face more and more, harder and faster. I could feel the blood gush and spray all over the bones in his skull crack and collapse. By the time I was done, there was nothing but smashed bone, brains, and blood. I panted as I stood back up and limped over to Margaret, who was now fully unconscious. I shook her and she finally opened her eyes, looking into mine with fear and confusion. "Margaret," I said, feeling relieved she was all right. I held her close, and we laid there until I looked over to where the body of the stranger should have been. He was gone, and panic arose once again, and we both stood up quickly. I turned to face Margaret, and screamed when I saw him standing behind her, still in the process of regenerating his face. Before I had the chance to react, he sunk his fangs deep into Margaret's neck. She screamed in pain as I screamed in rage, hitting the monster in the skull once again with my gun. I felt bone crack once again as he released her. Again, I mounted him and went to work, growing exhausted the longer it went. I knew this wouldn't last, as he would surely regenerate again. It soon became obvious what exactly I was dealing with. He had put Margaret into a trance merely by looking at her, even looking through a peephole. It wasn't until he invited himself inside that he actually got in. He had glowing red eyes and fangs, and he bit Margaret in the neck. While he was down, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed an old wooden broom. I broke it in half and ran back to the body, where I rammed it as hard as I could directly into his heart. The body began to convulse and flail its arms and legs all over. Suddenly, it stopped and went completely limp, before melting away into deep red blood and other disgusting fluids. After catching my breath, I slowly turned my attention to Margaret. She sat there in the darkness, legs folded and upper torso full erect. "Honey?" I said, nervously approaching her. In the darkness, I could only see her silhouette until her eyes began to slowly glow red. There was only one thing I could do. I love my wife. I would do anything for her, even if that meant chaining her up in the basement, feeding her a pint of my own blood every day, while I figure out what to do about her. When the hunger would hit her, she became like a wild animal that cannot be communicated with. So I fed her my blood, and she became herself again. She understood the situation and never held it against me. It wasn't easy, but it was all we could do. Unfortunately, a pint only went so far, until soon, it wasn't enough. So I gave her more and more, until the point that I was endangering myself with so much blood loss. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats and dogs. Soon I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home, knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long, before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, and I did as well. I love my wife, and I would do anything for her, which brings me to now. I'm sitting here, writing this, shaking. There is literal blood on my hands as I try to compose myself. She asked me to do one last thing for her. I refused at first, because I loved her too much. "If you love me," she began, looking me deep in my eyes, her now pale blues not blinking, "you will do this." Tears fell from both of our eyes as I pulled her in close. "I love you, Margaret," I whispered. "I love you, Henry." I could hear the squish as I drove the wooden stake in her heart. I trembled as I listened to her whimpers, gasps, and eventual silence. I broke down as her body melted away into liquid. I laid there in her remains, sobbing. I sit here now with nothing left but the warning about the creatures of fiction that are very much a reality. I write my confession of the crimes I have committed out of love. I say goodbye to any friends or loved ones that may be reading this. I loved her, and I did everything for her. It was Valentine's Day, and I was feeling so excited to spend the evening with my partner. They had gone above and beyond to make the day as special for me as possible, and I was so grateful for their love and affection. The bouquet of my favourite flowers was waiting for me on the kitchen table when I woke up, and my partner had picked out the most beautiful dress for me to wear on our dinner date. I felt so loved and appreciated, and I couldn't wait to spend the evening with them. As I got ready, I couldn't help but feel a sense of nervousness building up inside of me. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. Nevertheless, I put on my dress, took one last look at myself in the mirror, and headed to the kitchen to start the day. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed that my partner was there, looking uncomfortable and agitated. I asked them what was wrong, but they just brushed me off and told me everything was fine. I could tell that something was definitely not right. But I didn't want to start an argument on Valentine's Day, so I just let it go. We decided to spend the day cooking together, which was something we both enjoyed. We had a great time in the kitchen, laughing and chatting as we prepared a special dinner just for the two of us. I was so happy and content, and I felt like nothing could go wrong. But as the night went on, things took a turn for the worse. We started arguing over something small and insignificant, but it escalated quickly. My partner became erratic and started accusing me of cheating on them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could they even think that of me? I tried to explain that I would never do something like that to them, but they just wouldn't listen. In the heat of the moment, I grabbed a knife off the counter to defend myself. I was so scared, and I didn't know what to do. My partner just stood there, pointing at me with a crazed look in his eyes. The room was empty, and I felt so alone. I was scared for my life and for what my partner was capable of. In that moment, I realised that the person I loved was not who I thought they were. They had been hiding a dark side from me all along, and I was now in grave danger because of it. I managed to escape and run out of the house, but I was so shaken and scared that I couldn't remember how I got there. I eventually called the police, and they arrived quickly. They took me to a safe place, and I told them everything that had happened. They arrested my partner and charged them with assault and domestic violence. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The person I loved had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I was left feeling empty and alone. I spent the next few weeks in a state of shock and disbelief. I had thought that I knew my partner so well, but I was completely wrong. The person I loved was a stranger to me, and I felt so betrayed. I struggled to come to terms with what had happened, and I felt like my world had fallen apart. It's been a few years since that Valentine's Day, and I've moved on with my life. I've learnt to trust again and love with an open heart, but the memories of that day still haunt me. I'll never forget the feeling of betrayal and the fear that I felt that night. I have a secret crush that I've had for years. I never mustered up the courage to talk to them, but I've always admired them from a distance. They're the perfect mix of smart and cool, with nerdy glasses and a hoodie that makes them look just the right amount of casual. They're always surrounded by friends, but they always seem a little bit apart, a little bit distant. And they always seem so confident, like they're not afraid of anything. I used to daydream about what it would be like to talk to them, to have them know who I am. But I was always too scared to actually make a move. But then one day, I saw them walking alone in the rain. They were headed towards the bus stop, I think, and I just couldn't resist. I ran out into the rain and I caught up with them. "Hey," I said, a little breathless from the run. "Do you mind if I walk with you?" They looked surprised, but not unhappy. "Sure," they said. "I could use some company on this dreary day." We walked together in the rain, and for the first time ever, I felt like I was connecting with my crush. We talked about everything, from school to homework, and I couldn't believe how easy it was to talk to them. It felt like we were just two people, two normal people sharing a moment in the rain. And then, just as we reached the bus stop, my crush leaned in, and they pressed their lips against mine. It was the most magical moment of my life. I felt like everything was right in the world, like all the stars had aligned just for me. But then my crush pulled away, looking as surprised as I was. "I'm sorry," they said. "I don't know why I did that." I was heartbroken. I thought for sure that my crush had feelings for me, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was just a moment of madness in the rain. I was so confused that I didn't know what to do. I just started to walk away, but then my crush called out to me. "Wait," they said. "Please, I need to talk to you." We sat down on a bench and they explained everything. They told me that they had a secret too, that they had had a crush on me for years, but they didn't know how to tell me. They were scared that I wouldn't feel the same way, that I wouldn't like them back. But I did. I liked them more than anything in the world, and in that moment, under the rain, we finally confessed our love for each other. From that day on, we were inseparable. We walked to school together every day. We sat next to each other in class. We helped each other with our homework. And every day, I would receive a love letter from my crush, written in their perfect handwriting. It was the happiest time of my life. Until that day. I woke up. I had received a text from them. They were laughing at me. And then I received another text, more laughing emojis, from other people around the school. I was heartbroken. It was in this moment I realized that the whole thing was just a ruse. They didn't love me. They didn't even like me. It was all just a stupid joke, and I was the only one that wasn't in on it. So I tell you this story from my bedroom, miserable. I don't know what to do. All I know is, next Valentine's Day, I won't be leaving my house. It was Valentine's Day. I was bored, so I spent the day swiping right on the app. I did this thing where I would just literally swipe right over and over again until I finally found a match. Eventually, after about 100 different swipes, I was matched with somebody. He was an old man with a wrinkled face and a grey beard. His profile picture was very blurry, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to maybe try something new. We agreed to meet at a bar, and I arrived to find him already there, but he was drunk and very loud. I usually dated people my own age, but usually they would never call me for a second date. So I stayed, and he offered me a drink, so I accepted. As the night went on, he became increasingly creepy. His speech started slurring and his eyes wandering. I started to regret ever coming out with him. As the night was winding down, he offered to give me a ride home. I hesitated at first, but I was too drunk to drive and didn't have any other options. On the drive home, he started making inappropriate comments and I felt quite scared. I tried to ignore him, but he wouldn't stop talking. I just wanted to get out of that car and go home. But when we finally arrived at my place, he followed me inside. I told him that I wasn't interested in anything physical, but he didn't listen. He started to force himself on me. But in that moment I managed to push him away and run to the phone. I immediately called the police, who arrived just in time to arrest him. It turned out that the man was a notorious serial predator and had been lying on his profile. The police also found out that he had a sexually transmitted disease. I was lucky to have escaped unharmed, but the experience left me shaken and wary of dating apps. Nowadays, I make sure to be more careful about who I meet through the app. I've learnt to trust my instincts and to never compromise my safety for a date. I was just grateful I had a phone that night, because it allowed me to call for help and put an end to the man and his dangerous ways. I'm a 24-year-old girl who loves to celebrate Valentine's Day with friends. This year, my best friends and I decided to throw a party at my house to celebrate the occasion. We bought lots of flowers, alcohol, and even decorated my basement to look like a cozy party spot. The night started off great. We all got dressed up, took shots and drank beer, laughed and danced to our favourite tunes. The lights were low, and it created a warm, intimate atmosphere. However, things started to get strange as the night went on. I was in the kitchen getting another round of drinks when I noticed that the sliding glass door was open. I assumed that one of my friends had gone outside for some fresh air, so I didn't think much of it. But then I heard a strange noise coming from outside. I walked over to the door and peered into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I just brushed it off and went back to the party, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. As the night went on, the boys at the party started to get rowdy and things got a little out of hand. I tried to ignore it and just have fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The noise from outside had gotten louder and more intense, and I realised that it wasn't just the wind. I went to my room to take a break and calm down, but as soon as I laid down on my bed, I heard something coming from my basement. I got up and cautiously made my way down the stairs, but when I got to the bottom, I saw that all the lights were off. I fumbled for the light switch, but as soon as I turned on the lights, I was confronted by an incredibly frightening sight. There was a ghostly figure standing in the corner of the room, and it was looking directly at me. I screamed and ran back up the stairs, but when I got to the top, I realised that I was completely alone. I was so scared that I locked myself in my room and stayed there for the rest of the night. The next morning, I woke up to find that all of my friends had gone home and that everything from the night before was just a dream. But to this day, I can still feel the fear that I felt that night, and I never celebrated Valentine's Day again. I remember it like it was yesterday, the 14th of February, 2021, Valentine's Day. I had just moved into a new house in the countryside, and I was looking forward to a peaceful and romantic evening with my partner. But little did I know that this day was going to become one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It started snowing heavily that evening, and I noticed a police car parked outside my neighbour's house. I could see what was happening, but I could hear shouting and a police siren in the distance. The freezing air outside made it difficult to listen, but I could tell something was wrong. I decided to go out and take a look. I put on my warmest coat and stepped outside. The snow was coming down harder and I could feel the chill in my bones. I made my way to my neighbour's house and peered over the fence. I saw two police officers talking to my neighbour, and they seemed to be in a heated argument. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise coming from the frozen lake near my house. I ran towards the lake, slipping and sliding on the snow. to see what was happening. When I reached the lake, I saw a small boat in the middle, and it looked like someone was trying to get out. I could hear an echo of shouting and footsteps coming towards me. I turned around and saw 2 police officers sprinting towards me. Their faces were red from the cold. They told me to step away from the lake, but I couldn't take my eyes off that boat. I watched as the person in the boat finally managed to get out and started running towards the woods. The police officers instinctively took off after him, leaving me alone by the lake. I was shaking from the cold and from the fear that something terrible was happening. I decided to follow them, but I didn't want to be seen, so I stayed hidden behind the bushes. For some reason, I had my binoculars with me, and I watched as the person disappeared into the woods. I guess I had a feeling that something was off that night. The police officers followed close behind, and I could hear them shouting and calling for backup. The whole scene was honestly surreal, and I felt like I was watching a movie. I was scared, but also curious, so I decided to follow them deeper into the woods. After a while, I came across a clearing, and I saw a beautiful sight. It was a rose garden with roses of all colours, and they'd been set up in the middle of the clearing. The person who had been in the boat was just standing there, surrounded by the roses. It was in that moment that I realised it was all a Valentine's Day surprise for my neighbour. The police officers were just acting, and the loud noise from the lake was just a distraction. I was so relieved, and also a little embarrassed for jumping to conclusions. I went back to my house, and I couldn't wait to tell my partner about the exciting and scary experience I had just had. But when I walked into my house, the lights were off. I heard a tap dripping, so I slowly walked up the steps. It was coming from the bathroom. As I slowly creaked open the bathroom door, I was horrified by the sight in front of me. It was a man, smiling, and my partner was lying there on the floor, unconscious. I didn't know what to do, so I ran out sprinting down the road, calling for the police, but nobody was there. After hours of pacing outside the front of my house, waiting for police to arrive, I decided to walk into the house myself to see if I could fight off this intruder on my own. I slowly walked up the stairs. I opened the bathroom door once again, but there was nothing there, so I wandered down the corridor to the bedroom to see if he'd moved my partner, and he was now hiding somewhere else. Again, I slowly creaked open the bedroom door, but this is where I saw my partner, fast asleep. I walked in and slowly shook my partner awake. They turned around and looked at me, looking dazed and half asleep. "Why are you waking me up?" they said. "Were you in the bathroom a little while ago?" They said no, and then they rolled over to go back to sleep. I was so confused. I didn't know if it was a dream or if I just made the whole thing up. I decided to just climb into bed with them, and I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, everything was normal, but from that day on, I never took peaceful evenings in the countryside for granted, and I always appreciated the beauty of a surprise, no matter how unexpected it may be. But that lingering feeling of fear was always there, and always will be. I lived in a remote town, far away from any city, and I'd taken an Uber to spend some time in the countryside. The driver I was given was a strange man, and during the ride he never talked, but his creepy smile made me feel uneasy. I was the only passenger, and I remember feeling scared as the car made its way down a dark and empty road, only surrounded by empty fields. As we drove, I noticed that the moon was shining brightly, casting an eerie light over the landscape. The only sound that could be heard was the occasional screeching of a sheep in the distance. The cold air was biting, and I wished I had brought a jacket with me. Suddenly the car came to a stop, and the driver turned to me with a sinister grin. He told me that he had to check on something, and left the car, leaving me alone in the middle of nowhere. What was I supposed to do? I was paralysed with fear, and I remember looking out the window, trying to see something, anything, that could provide some form of comfort. But all I could see was darkness and fields stretching out as far as the eye could see. The only thing that broke the monotony of the landscape was a small fire in the distance. I wondered if the driver had started it, and what he could be doing. Suddenly, I heard a screeching sound that made my blood run cold. It was coming closer, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I was sure that I was going to die in that car, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hear my screams. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped, and the driver returned to the car. He still had that smug smile on his face, and I could see that his eyes were shining with an evil gleam. I don't remember much of what happened next, but I woke up in a hospital with no memory of how I got there. I later found out that the driver had been arrested for abducting young girls and taking them to the countryside, where he would terrorize them and leave them for dead. I was lucky to have escaped, but I will never forget that night and the fear that I felt in the car, alone on that dark and empty road. I was always a frequent Uber user, always on the lookout for a safe and reliable ride home after a night out. On this particular occasion, it was raining heavily, and I was so grateful that I was able to get a driver over. I was on my way to a famous club where I was invited to a party. I was told there would be celebrities there, so I was incredibly excited. As I settled into the back seat, I noticed the driver swerving in and out of lanes. I started to feel uneasy. Suddenly, there was a loud crash and the car came to a sudden stop. The driver had hit another car and I was thrown forward. I looked over and saw that the driver was drinking a bottle of whiskey. I was scared and I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear the drunk driver shouting and screaming, and I was trapped in the back seat, completely helpless. It was dark, and the rain was coming down even harder. The only thing I could do was try to call for help, but my phone had no signal. Eventually, the driver stumbled out of the car, and I was able to escape. I fell over onto the side of the road, dazed and disoriented. Luckily, a passing car stopped to help me and call the police. Once the police had finally arrived, they arrested the drunk driver and took him away. Despite the shock of the accident, I decided to continue on to the party, trying to shake off the fear that I had just experienced. When I arrived at the club, the music was loud and the lights were flashing. I ordered a drink, but it was too strong, and I soon found myself getting drunk. I was having a good time, but the memory of the crash and the fear I had felt earlier just kept creeping back into my mind. I was surrounded by people, but I felt alone and scared. I just wanted to leave. I ended up spending the night at the club, trying to forget about what had happened, but when I finally made it home, I was exhausted, and I didn't leave my house for days, too traumatized by the experience. That night was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I never took an Uber again. The cost of that expensive ride was just too high, and I'm not just talking about money. And I was left with a permanent reminder of the dangers of drunk driving. I was in the city for a business trip and needed to get to my hotel quickly, so I decided to take an Uber. It was a quiet night, and I was the only passenger in the car at the time. The city was experiencing a power shortage, so many of the street lights were off, creating a dim and eerie atmosphere. As we drove down an alleyway, I heard a faint giggling. My driver was completely unfazed by the sound, so I tried to brush it off as just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, we passed a homeless man wearing a mask, and he started to chase after the car. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the driver started to speed up, but the man kept pace with us, his laughter growing louder and more maniacal. The driver was getting more and more panicked, swerving the car and almost hitting a wall in an attempt to shake the man off. It was a very tight alleyway, but still the Uber driver was able to speed off at a reasonable pace, but it wasn't enough. I was sweating profusely and panting with fear as we made our way down the deserted streets. For a moment I didn't notice the man. I looked out the window and saw nothing but darkness. But then suddenly, the man caught up with us and yanked open the door. I screamed and tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. He dragged me out of the car and into an abandoned building. That was the last thing I remember. When I woke up, I was in a slaughterhouse, surrounded by the bodies of others who had been taken. I was covered in their blood, and I started crying, not knowing if I would ever make it out of there alive. I think a few days had gone by, not sure really, I'd lost track of time. But I was able to muster up the strength to get up as I pushed myself off of a body that was lying next to me, and I rise to my feet. I managed to find a door amongst the darkness, and I turned the door handle. As I slightly creaked open the door, the light pulsed through the open doorway, and I was immediately stricken by the beauty that was freedom. I ran out of that abandoned house, and I didn't stop until I saw a person. I screamed for help. They turned, looking very concerned. After all, there was a hysterical person running right towards them. But luckily, they stopped and listened to what I had to say. I was then taken to a local police station where I gave my story. This experience continues to stay with me in my dreams and my nightmares. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake it off. But for now, I'll keep trying. "5 years ago, I used to work as a driver for Uber. I remember this one time where I picked up a foreign man who seemed to be in a hurry. He had a briefcase with him that he held tightly throughout the entire ride. I remember as we drove, the man's behaviour became more and more erratic. He kept looking around nervously and sweating profusely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him and the way he was acting. When we finally arrived at our destination, the man handed me a stack of cash and told me to keep the change. I was about to thank him and head back to my car when he suddenly turned to me with a look of anger in his eyes. Before I could even react, he lunged at me and grabbed me by the throat. I was terrified, and I started to fight back, but he was much stronger than I was. He threw me to the ground, and I fell into a dark, black void. I was floating in an endless sea of darkness, and I felt a sense of fear that I had never experienced before. I was paralyzed with terror, and I couldn't move or even scream. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper in the distance. It was a voice that I couldn't quite recognize, and it seemed to be getting louder and angrier by the second. I tried to jump away from it, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt myself falling deeper into the darkness, and I couldn't stop myself from sliding down into the unknown. When I finally hit the bottom, I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I had broken it as I fell. I was in agony, and I started to plead for help, but the voice just laughed in a cruel, merciless way. I don't know how long I was trapped in that black void, wherever I was, but it felt like an eternity. I was lost in a world of pain, fear, and darkness. I never thought I would escape. Eventually, I woke up in a hospital room, and that's why I'm here today. Apparently, I had been rescued by a passerby who had heard my cries for help. I was relieved to be alive, but I could never shake the memory of that dark, haunting experience. To this day, I still have bad dreams about that night and the foreign man with the briefcase who had brought me to the brink of terror. I still have no idea what he was doing that night. I don't know who he was, and to this day nobody has been able to give me any information. I guess I'm just grateful to be alive, and maybe it's not worth asking any more questions. But still, I just can't help but wonder, who was that man? And what was in his briefcase? And the most important question, what did he want from me? So this story took place when I was in my mid-20s and had recently started working as an Uber driver. It was a way for me to make some extra cash while I was still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. But things took a turn for the worse one night when I picked up a very strange passenger. I remember it was a cloudy and heavy windy evening, and I had just finished a shift when I received a request from a rider. I hesitated at first because of the weather and the fact that I'd finished for the night, but I thought to myself, this is my last ride of the night, and I was feeling desperate for some cash. So I accepted the request and headed over to the pickup location. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that the atmosphere was eerie and it gave me a feeling of unease. The street was quiet and there was a sense of danger in the air. I can't explain it any other way, that's just how I felt in that moment. So I called the rider, but there was no answer. I decided to wait a few minutes and try again, but still, no answer. I was starting to get really nervous at this point, but I thought maybe they just needed a few more minutes to get ready, and as I'd driven all the way over there, I figured I may as well wait a few more minutes. A small time later, I heard a loud bang. It sounded like fireworks, but it was much louder and more intense. I looked out the window and saw a bright flash in the sky, followed by a loud roar. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. Then suddenly, the passenger appeared out of nowhere and got into the back of my car. Were these two events somehow linked? I was too scared to turn around and look at them, but I could feel their presence behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I could sense that something was not right. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't start. I was stuck there, with the passenger in the back seat, and no way to get out. The wind was getting stronger, and hail began to fall from the sky. It had become a full-blown storm by now, and I was really starting to panic. I finally managed to start the car, and I drove as fast as I could away from the pickup location. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake that feeling of unease, like there was someone behind me. I could see the passenger's reflection in the rearview mirror, and their eyes were locked onto mine. I could hear the sound of their breathing, heavy and slow. I was sweating profusely and my heart was racing. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Then finally I arrived at the destination, a field in the middle of nowhere. I stopped the car and turned to face the passenger, but they were gone. Or had they ever been there? I searched the entire car, but there was no trace of them. I was so confused and scared, but I had to get out of there as fast as I could. I started to run back to my car, but I stumbled and fell to the ground. That's when I noticed that my nose was bleeding, and there was blood all over my clothes. I was in a state of shock and couldn't understand what had just happened. Eventually, I was able to stumble back to the car and slide the key into the ignition. I attempted to drive home, and I was successful, but it wasn't easy. And to be honest, I was never the same after that night. I was haunted by the memories of what had happened, and that eerie feeling had consumed me. I was diagnosed with cancer a few months later, and I couldn't help but wonder if the two events were related. To this day, I can still hear the sound of heavy breathing and the bright flash in the sky. I can never forget the eerie feeling that I felt that night, and perhaps I never will. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.